Tanks is 10 plus years old now. Mouse was once the king of tier 10, now it's ruled by EBRs and chieftains. Premium tanks were once a novelty, now premium tanks are crowding the majority of the matchmaker. The game has obviously changed over the years, for the worse and for the better. Many people want to say for the worse though. This is understandable. The game has changed drastically over the years in so many different varying aspects that a reaction from the player base is guaranteed. But is this reaction due to blind nostalgia for that fresh, new, exciting experience of the game back when they first started playing, or is their critique towards the game's changes justified? World of Tanks is truly a game with so many hot topics, hot takes and polarizing opinions that it's pretty difficult to bluntly point out exactly what should be done to improve the game without any repercussions. In this video, we want to take a look at two major things. First of all, we want to identify the game's major problems. What topics does the player base keep arguing about, and what are our personal takes on them? And secondly, if the game has such an overabundance of problems, why is it so that so many players keep coming back to the game? Now, we are aware that the player base is on a decline, but it's a very slow one. If the game truly is so problematic that the community proclaims, the game should be dead, right? Right? So, we also want to identify the game's hooks. What aspects of the game makes people still play this goddamn game? Hello everybody, Zwhatsh from AwesomeEpicGuys here. Before we start the video, I just want to mention a few things. Firstly, some of the topics we will discuss in this video might seem like repetition if you have watched some of our other discussion videos, but we will try to expand and elaborate on these topics in this video. Secondly, the plan was that Edwin and I would narrate this video together in split segments, but after we finished the script, Edwin told me that he thought I suited better for these kinds of narration type of videos. So I'm gonna do this video alone today. However, Edwin and I did, as mentioned, write this script for this video together. So when I say we in this video, I am referring to me and Edwin here at AwesomeEpicGuys. So we equals AwesomeEpicGuys. Thirdly, the purpose of this video is not really to preach like the objective truth or how things like strictly are or what you should think about this game, because realistically what we say in this video is basically just our opinions, and we are just two guys screaming at video games, so our word should not be taken as strict law. But the purpose of this video is more so to raise awareness of like the game's many phenomenons and problems, so you as a viewer or a player or consumer can come to your own conclusions. If you do disagree with some of what we have to say here, please do let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe. And fourth and finally, I will segment this video into separate parts in the timestamps in below the video. If you're only interested in one specific part of this video, then you can just go to the timestamp below and head directly for that part. However, many of the topics that we will discuss here in this video will be related to each other. So to understand the full context, you probably want to look through the entire video at some point at least. So finally, there's a lot to talk about. We're gonna talk about power creep, EBRs, chieftains, artillery, matchmaking, all that stupid crap. So grab some cola and popcorn and fruchtdrink and buckle up, buddy, because this is gonna be a long schlong video. But firstly, let's begin on a positive note, the first hook of the game. World of Tanks has a pretty simple premise. Play a tank, destroy all the other tanks, or overtake their base. What is quite misleading in most of the promotional material though is that it's not really an action shooter. There are action elements in the game, such as shooting, but the game is fundamentally a real-time strategy game. It's very slow paced and emphasis is put on positioning and reading the map, outflanking and outsmarting your enemies, rather than reflexes and mechanical skill. This is where a lot of players probably realize that this is not the game for them and never plays the game again. But this is also where a lot of players realize that, yeah, this is the kind of game for me. Enough players to make wargaming a multi-billion-dollar company. Lol. The mechanical side of World of Tanks is rather simple. The abilities that are available to you are movement, which consists of rotating your tank to the left and right, going forward and reversing using the WASD keys. Fire your gun with the left mouse button, auto-aim with the right mouse button, camera zoom and movement with a mouse and a mouse scroll wheel, reloading if needed using the C key, switching between shell types using the number keys, the use of consumables which you can customize independently and use with the number keys, and some interface buttons like map size, HUD on and off. In theory, this sounds extremely basic and dull really, but in practice all of these functions have so many variable outcomes that it's hard to comprehend. We think that this is one of World of Tanks' biggest strengths, because almost all of World of Tanks' hundreds upon hundreds of tanks share the same controls and abilities. There are a few exceptions of course. Some tanks possess an additional mechanic with the X key, such as the siege mechanic, the speed mechanic and so forth, but generally the game is very simple to understand when it comes to mechanical inputs, due to every tank sharing the same base controls and functions. But it's how these few options work in practicality that makes the game shine. For example, in theory, you only have one way to attack the enemies, which is by shooting them, but by just moving your tank with the WASD keys, you can ram into other tanks, you can jump off ramps with enough speed and land on top of other tanks, you can push your allies to give them a boost to access new areas of the map, or even give them a speed boost to use them as a battering ram against enemies. The physics engine lets movement alone be another way of offense. Then we have the armor mechanic that ties into the movement. Depending on the armor characteristics of your tank and the way you present your tank towards an incoming enemy shell, your tank positioning will indicate if a shell you receive will actually do damage or not. Position yourself behind a pile of gravel and I will show your turret and you will be almost invincible. Be caught in an open field with your side open and well, rip. The gun can also be used in several ways. The obvious one is of course shooting the enemies, but you can also use it in other ways. You can position your gun barrel to block the shells of incoming enemies, you can shoot debris on the map to reveal enemy positions and help your allies get a clear shot. And then we haven't even mentioned all the RNG effects that can happen when the shell hits an enemy. We'll get to that. By making the controls of the game simple, but the many ways to use them complex, makes for an easy to grasp but satisfying and deep experience. When you have grasped the controls of the game and what their possible abilities are, then it's time to learn about the game's mechanics, which is, in our opinion, quite unique. World of Tanks has so many mechanics stacked on top of each other that just runs in the background that it's quite insane. Combined with the simple controls, we think this is where a lot of the enjoyment comes in though. World of Tanks is a lot about knowledge, knowing what specific tanks can do, knowing what view range is necessary on specific maps, knowing what shell is required in a specific situation, etc, etc. Let's begin with the most essential part of what makes the game going, which is the gun. When you see an enemy, a lot of things start happening. Firstly, you personally, you react to the enemy appearing, you then start rotating your tank's turret to start aiming for the enemy. The speed of the turret's traverse depends on the tank's individual turret traverse value, and depending on the tank's dispersion value, the aiming circle will become different amounts of smaller the longer you aim. The amount of time you have to aim before the circle reaches its smallest size also depends on your specific tank's individual parameters. The smaller the circle is, the higher chance for the shell to travel in the desired direction. When the circle is as small as it can get, you will have to make sure you aim at the enemy's tank's weakest part in relation to the side it's showing to you right now. Depending on the enemy's armor, the armor indicator will go from red, not likely to pen, orange, may be able to pen, and green, likely to pen. You obviously want to shoot at the armor profile that shows a green indicator. If there is none, you have several options. 1. Wait until the enemy shows a weaker side of the tank. 2. Relocates so that you get a better angle. Or 3. Reload to another shell that might be able to damage the relevant armor. If you finally get sight of a piece of armor that you think you will be able to damage, you fire the gun. After this, another internal process starts calculating. Depending on your tank's individual accuracy, the shell you fired from the gun will randomize its trajectory in relation to the spot where you aimed. The shell is more likely to hit exactly where you aimed if you are closer to the enemy, and less likely if you are further away. When the shell hits an armor profile of the enemy tank, depending on the penetration value of your individual shell, it will randomize a penetration value of plus minus 25% of the base value. If the shell penetrates the armor, depending depending on the individual shell's alpha damage value, it will randomize a damage value of plus minus 25% of that base alpha damage value. If the shell does not penetrate, it bounces off the tank or is absorbed by spaced armor. Whew. All of this is what happens in one single shell. Then we have other mechanics such as view range and camouflage. View range basically determines how far across the map you can see and your ability to detect enemy vehicles. Every tank's view range is individual but can be boosted by equipping the tank outside of the battle. Camouflage determines your ability to remain non-detected or invisible to enemy tanks' view range. And to maximize your camouflage, you want to equip your tank with camouflage boosting equipment, train your tank crew with camo improving skills, and stand behind bushes and foliage as you fire your gun. Some tanks also possess unique mechanics such as auto-loaders, auto-reloaders, double-barrel tanks, siege mode, turbo mode, etc. We could explain all of these and go over many more, but that would take an entire video. The point is though, World of Tanks has a very unique array of mechanics that aren't present in many other games before it. All of these complex mechanics combined with the simple controls and mobility options creates a very dynamic and exciting game that we think keep players hooked to the game. There aren't really any other similar games out there. Maybe War Thunder, but that game is also kind of fundamentally different. But that's a whole other discussion in of itself. We spoke about the tank's gun and its ability to switch between different shell types if necessary. Here we arrive at our first big problem that the community likes to discuss: the shell types. There are 4 different main shell types in the game. All of the shell types has individual parameters per tank, but has general characteristics as well. We have AP rounds, APCR rounds, heat rounds, and HE rounds. There are also other shells such as HESH, High Splash HE, as well as artillery shells. But we'll get to the artillery topic later. The main types consists of these 4, and on very rare occasions include HESH and High Splash HE. Each individual tank usually gets 3 slots of shells, most commonly 3 different types. Sometimes a duplicate of the same type, but we'll get to that. The general convention goes like this: a standard shell, usually armor piercing, sometimes APCR, and in some rare cases heat or HE. The standard shell is exactly what it sounds like, a conventional shell that's used in most situations. It has normal alpha damage and normal penetration. There is really not much to discuss about this one. It has always worked and will probably always do. Then we have the special round, or more commonly known as the premium round or gold ammo. This one is usually APCR or heat, but in some rare cases AP, HE or HESH. This is where things get funky. This premium round still has the normal damage, just like the standard shell, but has increased penetration. So realistically, this shell should just be better than the standard shell. Well, there are a few drawbacks that come with the shell types that usually fall under this designation, which is APCR and heat. APCR has worse normalization than AP and loses more penetration over distance, and heat usually has lower shell velocity and gets stuck in debris and spaced armor on tanks. Heat also has no normalization at all. Still, people are very upset about gold ammo. Why is this? Okay, let's break it down. In maybe 9 to 8 cases out of 10, premium ammunition is the superior ammunition type over standard ammunition. In some cases, you will have to adapt to the specific shell type disadvantages, but in most situations the higher penetration is much more favorable, especially when APCR is the premium round. Heat can be a little bit tricky to snipe with, for example, but is still very powerful. This is a huge problem though when a tank has the same 2 shell types for both the standard round and the premium round. Here there is literally no reason to fire the standard one over the premium one. Well, except for one single reason: to save credits, because that's where the difference lies: the price of the shell. The premium one usually costs many times more than the standard one. You could even pay for it with gold back in the day. That's where the gold ammo name comes from. And this is where the heated discussion comes in, because realistically, unless you are the most accurate player in the world and never fails to pen any of your shells, to be able to afford these expensive premium rounds, which you probably want to fire fire over the standard ones, you will need to have a premium account and premium tanks to avoid getting bankrupt if you play the game a lot, especially when playing tech tree tanks above tier 7. With a premium account, you gain more credits per battle, and thus you can fire more premium rounds without the same risk of going bankrupt. To get a premium account, you need to pay for it with gold or buy directly from the premium shop. You can also earn premium account time by taking part in events and completing missions, but these premium days will not last long. Of course, you can still maintain your in-game economy while firing premium rounds without a premium account, but it requires you to play in a very certain way that might not be favorable in the long run. So the problem here lies in two parts. The first part is standard rounds are usually kind of redundant in comparison to premium ammo, which damages the game dynamics and balance. And 2, the premium rounds are indirectly pay to win. Now, Wargaming actually tried to fix this, so that the premium rounds were not just blatantly better than the standard ones. The solution was simple really. Decrease the damage to the premium rounds so that the penetration remained superior, but the damage inferior compared to the standard rounds. They tested this with a player base on a separate test server, and the response was mixed. Ultimately, Wargaming scrapped the idea as they felt the community response was not convincing enough to implement it. What did the community say then? What we heard was, since the meta has evolved so hard around premium ammunition, they thought that many tanks would benefit from this rework in a non-favorable way. With the word meta, we mean how the current gameplay environment looks like, how the players have adapted to the current and most relevant mechanics of the game, and how this adaptation has shaped how the game is played and what are the most viable strategies. There are many tanks in the game that have been balanced in a way where they can pretty much only be penetrated reliably with premium ammo, at least frontally, leaving standard ammo more redundant. This is kind of a staple on how broken premium ammo is. We assume that the biggest worry here is that tanks such as the Obdic 279E will dominate even harder, and tanks such as the Panzer IIJ, Matilda and OI at low tier will dominate even harder, because nerfing the damage to premium ammo would ultimately lead to tanks such as these living longer, as the shells required to damage them frontally would now do less damage. Our opinion though, as we have previously stated in our tier 10 is bad video for example, is that these vehicles are few in numbers and can be rebalanced after the shell rework. We still think this change is the most logical solution that has been proposed. We have seen other ideas such as just decreasing the penetration a little to premium ammo so that the difference is not as obvious between the shells, and a limit to how many premium rounds you can carry. In our opinion, changes such as these would indeed be better than the current shell balance, but would ultimately only be like a small band-aid to the problem. The fundamental imbalance and the pay-to-win factor is still intact. There needs to be an obvious difference between the shells that promotes an active choice between shell types. We also need to remember that Wargaming is a company, and one of their main ways to make money in their free-to-play game is to make sure that you as a player spend more credits in your battles to encourage premium account and premium tank purchases. Solutions such as straight up nerfing the penetration on premium ammo or limiting how many you can carry to a battle will hurt Wargaming as a company with the current free-to-play model. Thus, this kind of approach will most likely never happen. Wargaming wants you to actively use gold ammo, so it needs an obvious hook, such as having superior penetration among the shell types. This is also why they will never decrease the price of them. Nerfing the damage on the premium rounds is the most simple and most effective way in our opinion. This has been implemented to World of Tanks Blitz, and that game is flourishing because of it. If some tanks suddenly get an indirect survivability buff, that will simply be something that we will have to deal with for a while, until they are fixed afterwards. We also believe that with the changes, people will have to readapt their way of playing the game. More flanking and armor would become more relevant again. A new meta could be born, and with 10 years on its neck, the game really needs a meta change to ruffle around the feathers of the game. We think this would feel invitational for old players who have left the game to return to the game and experience the new World of Tanks. The final ammunition topic is the third and last one in the shell slot: high explosive ammunition. This type of ammunition has always been a joker since day one. Its characteristics are low penetration but increased damage, but its most interesting feature is its ability to do minimal damage even if you do not penetrate the target's armor. Its purpose has always been varied and not really obvious. One usage has been kind of a last resort if neither standard ammo or premium ammo has been enough to pen some armor profile, then this shell would be used to splash upon an enemy tank's armor and do minimal damage. But if used over time, it would usually force an enemy to at least relocate, in for example a hull down duel. Another use would be to reset an enemy base. When an enemy captures your base in a tight situation, you usually can't afford to bounce a shell, because if you miss, the capture timer might be over before you have the time to reload. So then an HE shell would be used for guaranteed small damage that resets the base capture timer, so you have time to think again. Another use was using these shells to knock down trees, destroy debris, as to not waste other shell types doing so, and also because HE shells can destroy multiple sections of obstructables, such as buildings. Another use was to do minimal damage to tanks you do not even have a direct line of fire on. The high explosive shell actually had the ability to splash for damage in close proximity to the impact. We say had because this got changed, but more on that later. Also, as HE shells usually have a very low velocity and higher shell arc, it can in rare cases be used to lob above cover, such as a small hill. This way you can hit targets that thought they were safe. The final use of the shell would be to do a superior amount of damage compared to any other shell type in very specific situations. For example, the weakest part of any tank's armor is usually in the rear. If you are very cheeky, you can sometimes manage to sneak up behind a tank and pen them in the rear with HE, given that you had the HE penetration value required. Also, some tanks just generally have such a low amount of armor all around, tanks such as the Borsig, Scorpion, Grill, etc. Against these vehicles, HE is the most valid shell type to use generally, as it will pen in most cases. One additional mention of this shell type is that some tanks have guns specifically designed for firing HE, usually known as derp guns. The HE on these guns usually have HE penetration comparable to most other HE, but with massive alpha damage, way higher than most other shells. The meta of these types of guns are either don't aim and just splash a big shell into your enemy and always do a decent amount of damage, or aim very carefully and aim for a weak spot and potentially even one-shot kill the enemy. These guns usually have terrible accuracy and general gun stats to make up for this. But anyhow, we all know that Wargaming now changed this kind of shell type in the 1.13 update of the game. It came out of nowhere really, but the main problem that motivated the change seemed to stem from the shell being too inconsistent and kind of breaking the meta. Before, it functioned like this. Whenever HE impacted with anything, it would look for the weakest armor profile within its splash radius, and then do some splash damage upon that surface, depending on the shell's alpha damage. After the changes, the splash functionality was completely removed, so when the shell impacts, it will try and pierce through the armor it impacted, just like any other shell. This results in the shell sometimes doing 0 damage, as the penetration value is so low. This stands in big contrast to how it previously worked. This means that you cannot splash enemies around corners anymore, and you will now need to aim for weaker parts of the enemy's armor before you shoot. We think this is both a shame and good at the same time. In one way, the game becomes more mechanically consistent, the shell becomes more predictable, the game rewards skill more, and it still works the same against slowly armored tanks and armor profiles, which is nice. To some extent, it actually works better against lowly armored tanks, as HE does not get absorbed by tracks and such anymore. But at the same time, the game loses some dynamics. Being able to splash tanks around corners and splashing HE under tanks to cause moderate amount of damage was a really neat thing that you could do that really added to this satisfying experience that we mentioned earlier. World of Tanks really shines in its simplicity combined with its deep mechanics and possibilities. Now we got one of those possibilities removed from us, as well as making many derp guns lose their charm. RIP KV2 lol. Although a few problematic derp tanks certainly needed a rework, such as the T6 Medium, Shitbarn and the Death Star. A change we would personally like to see is that HE shells would always do some damage, as now there are many shells that do literally 0, and please reintroduce the splash mechanic, as it makes the game more dynamic and fun. And perhaps also look into some of the old time favorite derp tanks and give them some love, maybe in the shape of new better heat or AP shells for example. World of Tanks contains a lot of RNG. Some people claim to love this, and some people claim to hate this. I think most of the people who hate it would kind of miss it if it was removed though. Now, don't get us wrong here. Certain elements definitely need consistency to prevent people from ripping their brains out, lol. But some elements definitely flourish from it and make you go lol. And without the RNG, there would probably be less laughs and more rage. We're talking about fires, amarax, module damages, crew damages, damage rolls, RNG, you know, these kinds of things that just make the game a more wacky and enjoyable place. Even accuracy RNG is okay to a certain extent. Those times where you went full speed in your T49 and derped something across the map because you got ridiculous accuracy RNG would probably never happen if there wasn't any RNG. Or well, it would happen, but not to the same extent. So we believe that RNG is a healthy element for the game, as it makes it more entertaining and generally unpredictable. The amount of tanks also adds to this phenomenon. There are literally hundreds of tanks in the game, so seeing two games with identical lineups is extremely rare. All of these random elements breed a wealthy amount of personal battle stories. Oh, you know that one time I had 2 hit points and a full health mouse came charging at me, but a Jagdpanzer E100 shot him and set him on fire, and then I amaracked him. You know, these little stories that are created on the battlefield thanks to the RNG just makes the game a more wonderful place. And a great source of YouTube and Twitch memes. We genuinely think that the RNG alone, all the seemingly endless possibilities and scenarios that can be played out thanks to it, make people revisit the game due to how unique one playing session can be compared to another. Of course, RNG can sting when it happens to you, but you usually forget about these moments, while the epic RNG moment that benefit you will be remembered for the rest of your career. We are genuinely convinced that World of Tanks would be dead a long time ago without all the RNG element, as the game would not be such a rich source of cool storytelling and memes anymore. Well, there is obviously a bad side to the RNG too. This is mostly directed towards penetration RNG, which is honestly pretty bullcrap. Damage RNG, for example, is clearly telegraphed to the player on how much damage is done and how much damage needs to be done. If you see a tank on 300 health and your alpha damage is 260, it might be too risky to roll the dice for a high damage roll and instead to go for a tank with maybe 250 health or lower. You can make active decisions with RNG in mind, and if you low roll or high roll your damage, this is delivered to you through visual information on the screen, so that you understand the general spectrum of damage your shells usually do. And with this information you can dictate your engagements more effectively. Penetration RNG really got none of this. Of course, you can be assured that if you have 195 penetration, you will penetrate a Scorpion every time, because that tank just has ridiculously little armor. But if you are going up against an IS-3 that has around 200 to 230 millimeters of effective armor in the front, depending on where you hit, you can always guess that you might pen them with a high pen roll, but if you bounce, you have no idea if the shell bounced because you got a low pen roll, or if you aim the shell poorly, because you are not informed on how much penetration the shell you fired rolled for. Low pen rolls are especially bullcrap because you can get a low pen roll on a green marker and then bounce that area where the shell would hit in 9 out of 10 cases. It's just generally such a dumb thing to have. It shares plus minus 25% in its RNG spread, just like with most other RNG parameters in the game, so I guess Wargaming wants to keep the RNG consistent in that regard, but the penetration RNG really needs to be decreased to much lower values, maybe around 5%, or be removed entirely. If it cannot be reworked, at least let us know the penetration value of the shell we just fired through visual information on the screen somehow. Then we can at least know why our shell pen or not and learn from it. Or maybe give us an in-game version of the battle hits mod, or such a feature that War Thunder has, where you can see where the shell hit in an animated visual. We also want to mention accuracy RNG, which is something people get very upset about a lot. So how it works is that every individual tank has a different accuracy parameter. The better the accuracy, the higher the chance a shell will land exactly where you aim. The only thing you can do to increase your accuracy actively is by adding certain equipment to your tank and to fully aim your aim reticle in-game. But when the reticle is fully aimed, there is nothing more that you can do to avoid your shell from flying into an unfavorable direction. This is where many competitive players get upset and move over to vehicles with a higher base accuracy parameter. But even then, you will get trolled by the game's accuracy RNG. It's mostly painful when it's one of those shells that really needs to hit to win the game, and we can agree that it's frustrating as heck. But we have never really viewed it as a problem. It's just a part of how the game's engine works. Everybody has to pay respect to it, and since it's so established into the game, you can usually expect it. It's one of those aspects of the game, again, where you can make active decisions with RNG in mind. If you experience that your tank is not hitting anything, you simply have to get closer to the targets. It's an interesting dynamic of the game that encourages active play and more aggressive play. If every shell landed exactly where you aimed every time, many tanks would probably become overpowered. Accuracy is one of the most prevalent balancing factors in the game, so removing it would give every single tank in the game sniping capabilities, which would ultimately result in every player in the game just sitting around in the back, as their guns are reliable enough to hit weak spots from 300 meters away. It would discourage active play around the map, and it would make tanks with armor as main selling points even less relevant than they already are in the current meta. Some people have proposed to just decrease the accuracy RNG, but this still works towards the same non-dynamic environment as removing accuracy RNG altogether, just not as much. Also, wargaming would never change the accuracy RNG in the game because it encouraged more gold spam, lol. We think the accuracy RNG is good as it is. There are probably more underlying issues that can be addressed to decrease the general frustration of accuracy RNG, such as map design. If maps had more dynamic designs where you always had the option to get closer to your enemies or flank them for more direct and clear shots, instead of just hull down campfests on every map, we believe that accuracy RNG frustration would decrease. But we'll get to the map design topic later. The Matchmaker seems to be an everlasting discussion that has progressed through World of Tanks' entire lifetime. People have so many individual ideas on how the perfect Matchmaker should work. People want specific tanks to be limited to a certain number, certain tanks should go up against certain tanks, it should be skill-based, etc, etc. In our opinion, the Matchmaker is in a decent state. Not the best, but decent. It still needs improvement. First of all, +-2 matchmaking system is outdated. In 2011, when the player base had barely formed yet, the widespread matchmaking was understandable to make you find a game faster. The game could even put tier 5 and 6 tanks against tier 10 tanks in order to form a battle, and this along with how artillery worked, it's hard to compare. In 2021, it just doesn't work the same. The fact that today an M6 Heavy at tier 6 has the ability to face an Object 703 at tier 8 is just a baffling thought, honestly. The difference in individual tank performance is just too great to be considered a valid game balance decision. The counter argument here would be that the top tier tanks are few in numbers due to 3, 5, 7 matchmaking, so the chances of meeting a top tier tank while playing a low tier tank are slim. But if you actually play the game, you will notice that the top tiers will always cover the most relevant flanks, as most maps are like 2 to 3 corridors, resulting in you almost always having to deal with at least one top tier tank in these scenarios. Not to mention that the top tier tanks will usually be extremely influential on how the entire team plays, while the bottom tier tanks often feel like minions and gun fodder. This also makes the spectrum of a single tank's role too wide. The M6, as mentioned, top tier is a heavy close quarter brawler, but low tier its role ends up being something in line with third line defense tank or support. Some people do enjoy this dynamic, and we can see why. It's a nice challenge. But a lot of tanks become obsolete in a low tier matchup, and it's mostly highly competitive players who actually do enjoy this kind of challenge, and it shouldn't be a mandatory feature integrated to the base game. The only purpose we see for +-2 in modern World of Tanks is to give less experienced players a chance to have a really good game once in a while. But more often than not, when these players are given the responsibility to carry the team as a top-tier tank, that team in question just instantly falls on its face because the opposing top-tier tanks were just better. It's not a great idea to just give a few players of the team such a big influence on the battle outcome. And well, of course, +2 matchmaking again encourage more gold spam, which is probably why it exists too. And I guess another point on why it exists might be to create kind of like a sense of progression and a motivation to climb the tech tree. You know, when you see a tank on the battlefield that is more powerful than yourself, outperforming yourself in the same game, you get a glimpse of what you could potentially do if you play the game enough to get that far into the tech tree. And this is actually a valid and interesting strategy, but +-2 is just too much. +-1 is good enough to serve the same purpose, and it will make the game much more enjoyable and fair. This has already been implemented at low tier up to tier 3. It's not until tier 4 that +2 is present, and low tier is so much more enjoyable thanks to that. With +-2 gone through the entire game, that should drastically make it easier to balance all the tanks of the game, because as of now, every change implemented to each and every tank will need to be made in respect to the fact that the same vehicle can face both vehicles 2 tiers lower than itself and 2 tiers higher. It has to be a nightmare to balance vehicles like that, honestly. No wonder Wargaming needs to collect data for like 6 months before doing literally anything. With +-2 removed, that's 2 tiers gone out of the balance equation. Boom, easy. This is extra prevalent in tanks that rely on armor, as their armor can go from worthless to overpowered just because of the matchmaker. Decreasing the matchmaking spread should make it easier to balance these kinds of vehicles. Wargaming could keep +2 matchmaking in the game, but make it very rare. Make it appear only on the occasion where there are literally no other ways of forming a battle. This way +2 and -2 would be something to be excited for. Instead of, well, here we go again with +2 again, it would be, oh my god, +2? This is like the first time in a month. I think that would be much more preferred than the current experience. Another problem with a matchmaker is that there are no hard limits for certain tank classes. The only limit that exists is for artillery. The limit for artillery is 3, but it should probably be lower, maybe 2 or even 1. We'll talk about this later though. Light tanks have no limit at all in random battles. This is kind of a problem as most maps are really only optimized for maybe 1 or 2 light tanks per map. Often when we play light tanks and there are 2 per team, one of the lights finds the only good light tank spot on the map, and then the other light tank feels redundant. The only time 2 light tank per team feels somewhat relevant is when one is a wheel tank and the other is a tracked, as the tracked usually prefer a passive scout role and the wheeled one usually prefers an active scout role. Of course, there are definitely exceptions to this rule. The point is though, the more light tanks per team, the less their individual role has significance. Eventually some will try and take a medium tank role or just run around doing nothing, and more often than not just go and die because they have nothing to do. And this usually results in very weirdly paced games. And sometimes light tanks of the same team even starts competing against each other for spots. There needs to be a hard limit for light tanks, maybe 2 or maximum 3. We feel like they already feel somewhat redundant at 2, but definitely 3 maximum. The same goes for tank destroyers. Currently there are no hard limit for tank destroyers in the matchmaker. We really have no raw numbers to back up this claim with, but we feel like games with more tank destroyers usually have a higher chance of ending up in a draw, or at least like a 13 to 15 minute dragged out campfest. Tank destroyers as a class are generally a pretty inactive class and only have opportunities to move around the map very late in the game. Most players play tank destroyers as snipers or choke point holders. This makes make games with an overabundance of tank destroyers extremely stale and lame. To make matters worse, most maps usually only have a few good sniping positions on them where tank destroyers usually go, which makes players fight other players on the same team for those positions. There should be a hard limit on maybe a maximum of 3 to 4 tank destroyers per team. We haven't really thought about an optimal number, but they definitely need to be limited, at least for sneaky or high camouflage tank destroyers. Assault tank destroyers could actually be treated like heavy tanks by the matchmaking, as they usually take a more active role. The problem really lies with the sneaky or sniper tank destroyers. Then we have the question about skill-based matchmaking. Lately, there has been a trend of 15 to 1, 15 to 0, 15 to 3, 3-minute Roflstomps and such games. Basically, a lot of games where one team has a dominating upper hand and just erases the other team without difficulty. Here you beg the question if you are even playing a game anymore, or if you are just watching a farming simulator unfold. Many people claim that if the matchmaker would account for individual skill level amongst players in the matchmaker, these kinds of Roflstomps would occur less frequently due to the performance of the teams being more on par with each other. This does sound like it makes sense. However, from our experience, the numbers show otherwise. For example, in the ranked game mode, where most players are top-level tryhard unicoms, these kinds of games still appear frequently. And if you look back at old footage, these games have been around since the beginning of World of Tanks, really. We're actually not sure if the amount of Roflstomps have increased over the years, or if they have just been noticed and mentioned more by the player base in recent days. However, the problem still stands. But we don't think that changing the matchmaker to account for player skill will necessarily improve this problem. We believe that the problem does not lie within the skill gap between players. We think it's a culmination of many combined factors, such as experience boosters, new overpowered bounty equipment, power creep, wheel tanks, crew box, an influx of offloaders, and also an influx of events and missions. People just want to be accomplished with in-game events quickly and fast, instead of actually being bothered to play the game itself. We think the gameplay during marathons like the Stirb K marathon is proof of this. The gameplay during marathons is almost exclusively 15 to 2 Roflstomps. Instead of playing quality games, people seem to think that playing quantity games without quality will make them progress the marathons faster, but this is completely false. So a small solution in the right direction to solve this Roflstomp issue could be for Wargaming to switch its focus with the events and missions in the game to be more quality oriented than quantity. There are a lot of missions in the game where you simply just have to get a kill or two or collect X amount of experience. And yes, this is a good way of keeping your player base active, and it will look good in numbers, and you will have an active player base on paper, but it ruins the quality of the game. If the missions would be more in line with like get a first class medal or get 3 second class medals in a row, then maybe people would try and play better generally, and maybe the Roflstomps would decrease. However, the Roflstomps are usually caused by a sort of domino effect. Maybe 1 or 2 vehicles on the same team dies in quick succession. This shouldn't be a big issue since there are still 13 tanks on the team, but it actually is. Since World of Tanks is such an HP and DPM focused game, it's hard for the team to recover from such a loss, unless the blows between the teams are very well balanced. This is why you see a lot of Roflstomp in ranked, because the players in there are well aware of the flow of the game and will take advantage of a small window in the battle scenario. Because of this, it's really hard to just fix the 15-0 Roflstomp problem with just one simple move. As we said, we believe it's a culmination of many problems and not just focused on matchmaking, for example. We believe by just generally improving other aspects of the game, like missions, power creep, and other aspects, the Roflstomp problem will progressively get better. One factor to why these 15-0 games occur could be due to another problem with the game. Mouse, AMX50B, IS-3, FCM50T, Emil-1. What do these tanks have in common? Not much really, but they are all heavy tanks apparently. Maus is more of a huge, lumbering juggernaut, damage sponge. 50B, sure it's big and heavy, but it cannot take hits at all and is more of a mobile support, hit and run kind of tank. Emil-1 is more of a ridgeline hunter. Its turret is capable, but generally it's small, compressed and not really suited to receive any hits if caught behind the ridgeline. FCM is a big cardboard and IS-3 might actually fall in line with a conventional heavy tank role. There are several problems with clumping these tanks together as having the same class. Firstly, the matchmaker. A heavy tank needs to go up against an enemy heavy tank, medium versus medium, and so forth. The purpose of this is obviously to make both teams have as equal a chance as possible to win the game, tank-wise. But when a Maus is going up against an AMX 50B or a Kranvagn goes up against an E100, things are not really well balanced. The roles these vehicles take are vastly different and usually ends up with the E100, for example, dominating the conventional heavy city flank or the Kranvagn dominating the ridgeline area of the map, while the enemy team didn't get a tank of the same class with the same intended role suited for the current map. And we'll talk about this later, but the maps in World of Tanks are usually pretty one-sided, where one flank is usually the superior one. And if one team has a tank that just works better at that certain flank and the enemy team does not, well, there we have an imbalance problem. Another problem with this class system is that it makes it more confusing as to what you are actually supposed to do with a vehicle. I've seen so many times in the team chat where someone is angry because I didn't go city in my T-54E1, for example, to support his Type 5 heavy. Yeah, we are the same class, we're both heavies, but our roles are vastly different. And this is hurting new players to the game a lot, because on many YouTube map tutorials, for example, you will see the narrator tell you that this flank is mostly suited for heavy tanks, and this flank is more suited for medium tanks, etc. And this makes people play their AMX-40s as scout tanks and their T-95s as snipers. Lol. The class system is also very inconsistent through the tiers. At low tier, light tanks are either medium or light tanks, but sometimes even super heavy tanks like the Panzer II and AMX-40, lol. Medium tanks are either mediums or heavy tanks, or super heavies again, Matilla. And the actual heavy tanks are more like slow medium tanks. Lol. This even escalates this confusion when it comes to classes. This could, as mentioned, be a supporting factor for the 15-0 Roflstomps games, as people might think they know where to go in a tank, but it just doesn't work because the tank's intended role does not match the class, so they just go and die basically. It's just generally confusing and dumb. Especially considering Wargaming is putting high emphasis on the new player experience with all their recent changes. What can be done to fix this? Well, Wargaming actually came up with an idea for this many years ago, which eventually got scrapped. They had class ideas named Juggernaut, Support, and so on. We think this is an idea worth revisiting. Tanks need more clear designations for players to understand a tank's role more specifically, but also for the matchmaker to balance tank roles equally. Now, there can't be too many roles, because if there are too many, the matchmaker will probably have trouble finding a game and start getting slower, but convert the current amount of classes into new ones and then add maybe a few more. Now, they did actually introduce these small hint panels in the most recent patch as to what kind of a role a tank should perform, and this is excellent. It's a good step in the right direction to teach new players how they should play a tank, but there are still no panels for low tier tanks, and these intended roles still do not affect the matchmaking. They could keep working on this concept by implementing small tutorials within the game to how certain intended roles should play, and the roles should also be visible in-game to have more significant meaning. But here are some suggestions to how current classes could change into a more suited one, and a small set of new classes that could be implemented to improve the matchmaker and make the roles more reasonable. So first off, the current heavy tank could be changed into maybe assault/brawler. You know, tanks such as the IS-3, M6, T-29, AMX M4, 113. Basically tanks with armor potential, and with aggressive frontline capabilities, but also moderate mobility. Many medium tanks could also be included here, such as many Russian medium tanks like Object 430U and Object 140. The current medium tank class could be converted into like hunter/sniper, you know, tanks with moderate to low armor and moderate to high mobility that can take several roles but excel in maneuvering different positions on the map and take flanking shots or long-range shots. Tanks such as the STB, Leopard 1, AMX-30, etc. The current light tank would change into recon/scout. Their role would fundamentally remain the same as before though. Light tanks would mostly take this role. The difference would mostly lie in the lower tiers where many tanks currently have the light tank designation but are not really scouts, such as AMX-40 and Panzer IIJ, which would take a new role instead, and we'll get to that later. We also think that tracked tanks and wheel tanks should split into two new classes: recon/scout tracked and recon/scout wheeled. Tank destroyer would change into like assault gun or something in those lines, because the term tank destroyer in World of Tanks is generally pretty confusing. When we think about a tank destroyer in the game, we mostly think about like casemate tank destroyers, you know, as in tanks with the gun stuck in the chassis with no turret that usually takes a passive long range or choke point role. But you know, there are also tank destroyers that have turrets and thrive better by taking a more active role, you know, like Hellcat and T-67. And other tank destroyers are super heavily armored and are more suited for frontline combat, like AT-2, Tortoise, T-95, Jagdpanzer E-100. This is why the general tank destroyer role should be dismissed and all current tank destroyers should be fit into new roles. The sniping casemate tank destroyers with no armor lands in this role, the long range role, while tanks such as Hellcat or T-67 might end up in the hunter/sniper role, and tanks such as the Jagdpanzer E-100 ends up in a new role, which we'll talk about later. Artillery remains the same because, you know, it's a pretty unique class that has never really face the same class problem. No class rework is necessary there. And then let's propose a few new classes. Firstly, we have Juggernaut, which is a name that Wargaming themselves toyed with, and basically include lumbering huge beasts that are built to take a lot of beatings, but can usually deliver the same one back. Tanks such as E-100, Maus, Type 5 Heavy, but also tank destroyers such as Tortoise, T-95, Jagdpanzer E-100, and even tanks such as the TOG. Support. Tanks that can not really excel on their own and thrive in wolf packs with other tanks surrounding them. Usually autoloaders such as 50B, T-54E1, ML1, TVP, but maybe even one-shot tanks such as FV250B and TVP VTU. This overhaul of the class system would probably be very complicated, however, and might even bring in some new unexpected problems. But at least we wanted to plant this idea for you guys. Let us know what you think. We have mentioned a lot about tanks by now, but we haven't really talked much about the tank itself as a phenomenon. It was pretty much World of Tanks that popularized the tank in modern times. Before we started playing the game, any tank was only just that, a tank. But now, every time we see one, we usually identify it from its actual name. Oh, that's a Tiger. Oh, that's an IS-3, and so on. And if we don't know its name, we are curious to know about it. World of Tanks has really opened up our eyes to something that was pretty niche before the game. Well, it still is, but not as niche. Anyhow, this general interest in tanks has also sparked an interest in World War history, and history in general really. It really makes you excited when Wargaming puts new historical tanks into the game, because it kind of feels like seeing one of your favorite real-life heroes being reimagined in a video game. Now, Wargaming has strayed away a bit when it comes to historical accuracy to focus more on game balance, functionality and mechanics, but every now and then Wargaming introduces a well-known tank from real life into the game, and it's very exciting. If you are a fan of tanks specifically, you probably either play World of Tanks or War Thunder. This focus on tanks is something you don't really see in many other games, and it's probably why enthusiasts stick around for World of Tanks. We have been playing this game since 2011, and we still have not unlocked everything in the game. There are so many things to do, so many things to see and get. There are hundreds of unlockable playable tanks in the game that keeps you hooked and interested to see more. One game, you might get destroyed by a cool looking vehicle and think to yourself, how the heck did he do that? Well, after you proclaim that he was a lucky noob, of course, lol. But after the game, you check out the tank in the tech tree and notice that it's looking pretty interesting. So you start grinding for the tank, and after you finally unlocked it and played it, you got more of an understanding on how that guy killed you in that tank. This is just a small example of what kind of game World of Tanks is. There are so many tech trees to grind, there are marathons where you can grind for a chance of getting a free premium tank, there are event game modes, recurring game modes, competitive modes such as Clan Wars where you and a huge team try and take over the world basically. There are missions where you can get exclusive tanks, you can try and grind for marks of excellence, grind bonds to purchase rare tanks, etc. and etc. And while this is going on, Wargaming always seems to have another event lurking around the corner. The point here is, World of Tanks is a game that never stops giving. If you are a completionist that wants to collect literally everything, tanks, 2D styles, 3D styles, commanders, emblems, decals, 3 marks and medals included, you will probably never stop playing this game. There is always something to do in this game, which is amazing. It puts more emphasis on you as a player dictating what's most important for you when playing, because realistically you will probably never get all the things in the game. Especially since there are so many premium tanks that sell for real world money. The amount of content and unlockables in the game are at copious amounts, which makes the game seem endless. This might sound overwhelming, and it can definitely be. We would not complain if Wargaming calmed down a bit with all the events, to give us a breather to play the game casually for a while, but this also makes you constantly feel rewarded for just playing the game. There are also such a large amount of maps in the game, and combined with the sheer amount of tanks and lineup possibilities, you seldom feel like the game feels too repetitive. Every time you boot up the game, there are plenty of things you can decide to do, and the clear path forward is never really obvious. And it makes the game exciting to play, as you can decide to do anything really, but still always progress towards something. The year is 2012. Zwhatsh and Edwin E20 are playing their newly acquired Jagdpanzer E100s that were released a few patches ago. The team is calling them noobs for playing such ridiculously broken vehicles with 1000 alpha damage, when suddenly a wild T-62A appears. Oh frick! Edwin and Zwhatsh proclaims as their broken monster tank gets ripped apart by this blatantly overpowered Russian meta tank that has everything: armor, mobility and rate of fire. Zwhatsh and Edwin rages as they are sent back to the garage and whines that the T-62A is a freaking overpowered noob tank and needs a nerf. Fast forward to 2021, Edwin and Zwhatsh are playing their good old-fashioned Jagdpanzer E100s and are called masochist memers for playing such obviously underpowered and out-of-meta joke tanks that gets penned and ripped apart by everything, when suddenly a wild T-62 appears. Oh frick, people actually play that thing? Finally some free damage. Edwin and Zwhatsh proclaim and plant 2 heat rounds right in the Russian trash tank's face and send it back to the garage. The meta has evolved drastically over the years, as more extreme tanks have progressively been implemented into the game. We touched on this topic in our Tier 10 is bad video as well. In that video we stated that for a modern video game to stay fresh and exciting in the ocean of modern video game competition, new content and iterations of a game is mandatory for it to stay relevant, both to keep seasoned players hooked but also to invite new players into the game. However, to keep seasoned players interested, the new content must contain some sort of wow factor, something new and exciting basically. What usually happens in, for example, competitive games is that the developers release something that is just a tiny bit stronger than the rest of the competition, that usually contains some fresh new feature that the player base wants to try out. Now, what happens when this same process is done again and again over the span of several years? Well, in World of Tanks' case, the oldest tanks become irrelevant, as with the case of the T-62A. That thing was considered one of the strongest tanks back in the day, and new tanks become the meta, for example, the Chieftain and EBR. This phenomenon of old becoming less and less competitive in comparison to the new, which becomes the meta, is known as power creep. This is not an uncommon phenomenon though. This happens with basically every competitive video game in existence that has lived longer than a few years. The fact that World of Tanks has lived for over 10 years is pretty damn uncommon though. However, this also means that the power creep has been iterated a lot of times throughout the game's history, and it also makes it more difficult to actually balance it out. Because the common solution to power creep is obviously just buff the irrelevant tanks or nerf the meta ones, or both. Why is power creep bad then? It hurts the player's choice and the dynamics and fairness of a game. What power creep does is, in World of Tanks' case, it invalidates a majority of the roster of playable tanks. Why play the T110E5 when you can play the Chieftain? Why play the IS-3 when you can play the Object 703 version 2? It also feels extra lame when the better tank is in many cases a premium or a reward tank you cannot get. And it's especially hurtful in a game such as World of Tanks, because imagine you grind through an entire tech tree for several months. Let's say for example the AMX50B. You finally reach it and you are so happy, only to realize that the Kranvagn of the same tier does pretty much the same things as the AMX50B, but better. Oh well, I only spent those months for nothing, lol. Of course, the 50B is not completely useless and is still playable, but considering that tier 10 is the most competitive tier in the game, just playable is not really enough. Almost every tier in the game has their own overpowered meta/broken tanks. This might be a bit subjective, but here's a small list. Tier 1 has T1 Cunningham, Tier 2 M2 Light, Tier 3 Panzer II J and FCM, Tier 4 Matilda, Tier 5 has Panzer V4, Left, T67 and KV-222-2, Tier 6 has T34 McDonald's, Type 64, Tier 7 has T29 and E25, Tier 8 has Progero and Object, Tier 9 have Kampfpanzer and the Concept, and Tier 10 has Chieftain, EBR, 279E Kranvan and Object 907. This list can be extended much further or slimmed down even. It depends on where you wanna draw the line basically. The point is, there is always a few tanks that just play in a completely different league than everybody else, and are always the logical pick if you just wanna win games and perform well, which makes the other tank of the same tier somewhat redundant. We have stated this before too, but complete balance is impossible to achieve unless you let the game contain like only one single tank available per tier that everybody has to play, lol. If you want to play a completely balanced game, go play chess or something. But the thing is, everybody has a different taste and preference in gameplay style, and this is why there are so many different tanks to choose from in World of Tanks, to try and satisfy as many players as possible with as many variable choices as possible. But the problem is that only a few percent of these choices are viable, and this is where the balance problem lies. In order to stay competitive, you might be forced to play a tank that you necessarily do not enjoy playing. We do not think it's possible to make every tank in the game on par with each other, but there should at least be more tanks worth playing, and all tanks should have something to offer, so that more personal preferences are satisfied and makes the game more fair. There should be no tanks that are just laughed upon seeing. Even if a tank is labeled as subpar, it should have at least one redeeming factor that you will have to respect. There are too many tanks in this game that are just labeled as jokes or masochist tanks, that you only play as punishment or for the memes. Now, don't get us wrong, we love trash and memes here on this channel, but it's mostly because we think it's hilarious to win in these kinds of vehicles against stronger opponents. We would actually love to see these vehicles getting a well-deserved buff. Shovel! So how do we achieve this balance? Well, as stated before, the easy fix should just to nerf the overpowered meta tanks and buff the less competitive and irrelevant trash tanks. Well, yeah, but how? Wargaming has actually already started with this process already, which is nice, but it's mostly buff to non-meta tanks and no nerfs to overpowered tanks. And the buffs are given out in small doses over way too much time. By the time a new buff has arrived, the meta has already changed slightly, and the buffs are seldom drastic, only small quality of life changes. They do not change the battle environment much. We do understand why though. Wargaming is afraid that if they change the parameters too much, a tank will suddenly become crazy overpowered, and this has happened in the past with, for example, the T110E5, the Mouse and the Type 5 Heavy, which kind of broke the game for a little while before they got nerfed again. We definitely don't want to go back to that, but what wargaming could at least do is, instead of just buffing small things on a few tanks every now and then, both buff and nerf small things on many tanks more often. Yeah, we understand that you need to collect data for like 6 months before you can make those calls wargaming, but we believe it's time to take some risks. The game is old and the player base is questioning your competence more for every day that passes. You need to shorten that 6-month analysis window somehow. For example, by removing +2 matchmaking and make it +-1 instead, so you don't have to keep the +-2 tier spread in mind while rebalancing vehicles. The reason for this long analysis window and the small buffs instead of major ones is most likely because it's very easy to buff a tank, but much harder to nerf it, as it might piss off the wrong people. More on that later. What specific things need to be done to buff underpowered vehicles and nerf overpowered vehicles then? Oof, that's a big one. The game contains literally hundreds of tanks, so we can't really go into specifics much, but the biggest problem is that there are only a few handful of tanks standing at the top of the meta chain, and these vehicles need to be brought down to a level where they blend in more with the rest of the competition instead of being objectively better. They shouldn't be nerfed to trash, just nerfed enough so that they are not obviously the most competitive choice. This should be the first step, as these vehicles are few in numbers and should be easier to get an understanding of. The problem here is that most of these highly meta tanks are either premium tanks or reward tanks. The Chieftain, Object 279E, Panzer 5-4, Left, T-34 McDonald's, Panzer 2J, etc. Nerfing these vehicles will definitely piss off wargaming's most important customers. The highly competitive customers who have dedicated thousands of hours into this game and unlock these reward tanks after a painful clan wars or ranked grind, and the paying customers who have paid for said premium tanks and might own a copious amount of them. Now, something needs to be clear. There is a myth that wargaming legally cannot nerf premium tanks, but this is not the case. They can and they have in the past. The Type 59 and the Super Pershing are notable examples. It's only that the only few times it has happened, the response from owner of said premium tanks have been overwhelmingly negative, and therefore wargaming has refrained from nerfing premium tanks generally afterwards. They even offered a refund of the Super Pershing, and this is probably where the common misunderstanding that wargaming legally cannot nerf premiums come from. But wargaming purely made this out of courtesy and not out of legal obligation. This is kind of distasteful from the community side, but also from wargaming side. If the community truly wants World of Tanks to be a fair and balanced game, they need to accept that even things they have paid for are subject to change, and wargaming needs to get some balls and actually make healthy changes to the game, even if some backlash appears. The counter argument here is, of course, well, if I paid for a premium tank, a product, it is not in the developer's right to alter the product after I paid for it. Well, you would be right in most cases. In World of Tanks' case, though, it states clearly in the user agreement that everything you pay for is subject to change. Let's compare this to any other game that is not free to play. I guess you would call them pay to play, or rather just normal games. These entire games, with the same logic as these outraged premium tank owners, are products. So, should the player base of those games be outraged whenever the developers decide to nerf or change literally anything in said game? Some might be angry for a while when their favorite character or feature gets nerfed, but the consensus usually lands somewhere in, yeah, that was a good healthy decision for the game. This mindset needs to be taken over into World of Tanks. It seems as if a combination of the World of Tanks consumers' selfishness and wargaming's cowardness has driven a lot of the game's balance in the wrong direction. And this is most apparent in the game's meta tanks, as many of them are locked behind paywalls and haven't been changed since introduction. What wargaming is probably afraid of here is that if nerfing premium tanks becomes a common practice, it will make consumers more likely to hesitate before buying new ones, since it might get nerfed afterwards. What consumers need to understand here is that when you buy a premium tank, you are not paying for ownership of said tank. You are paying for access to a feature that's already within the game, and the owner of the game is wargaming. Then there's the reward tanks. The hottest topics surround the Chieftain and the Object 279E. The Chieftain is currently impossible to get, as the only method of achieving this vehicle was through specific Clan Wars campaigns, either if you managed to reach high enough on the leaderboard or if you managed to snatch it for a ridiculous amount of bonds in an exclusive Clan Wars auction that was only available during the relevant campaigns. The Chieftain is often said to be the best tank in the game, and to make matters worse, you cannot currently get it, and is mostly owned by highly competitive players. Object 279E is similar. It is highly difficult to achieve this vehicle. You need to complete 3 sets of infuriating missions. Some actually require skillful play, but some just require pure luck. But at least everybody can get the vehicle. These reward vehicles, for some reason, seem to get the same treatment as premium tanks when it comes to their lack of rebalancing. We talked about this in our tier 10 is bad video as well. The short version of the discussion we had in that video was, we can see why this is. If you grind your ass off through a competitive mode in pursuit of getting a juicy reward tank at the end, you will undeniably get disappointed if that reward gets changed for the worse later on. But yet again, it's about that mindset we talked about earlier. World of Tanks players need to accept that everything in the game is always subject to change in the name of the health of the game, or rather it should be that way. We have all grinded our asses to tier 10 through the tech tree several times actually, just to get a tank that later gets nerfed. But what people seem to ignore is that another tank we grinded to that was complete shit later got buffed. We are not saying that people should always demand or expect changes to happen, but rather be prepared and open for changes. Because the fact is, World of Tanks is always changing. Everything is always changing. Whoa. Anyhow, I think we got our point across. Nerf the overpowered tanks down to reasonable levels, regardless of their premium or reward status. Thereafter, bring up the trash tanks to a reasonable level. Easy. Done. What to do exactly with every tank? More on that on the next topic. Small side note, we think the Panzer V4 is actually the best tank in the game. Like, holy shit, that tank is broken tier for tier. 2000 base experience required for Ace Tanker, and it's black market exclusive, also known as you can't basically get it. The Panzer V4 is more or less a tier 7 tank at tier 5 with premium matchmaking. Jesus Christ, German bias confirmed. We believe that one of the biggest criminals behind many of the game's problems can come down to the fact that armor and weak spots have become less and less relevant in the World of Tanks meta over the years. In the beginning of the game's life, looking for and shooting at weak spots was basically how you played the game back in the day. It really added to the strategic part of World of Tanks. If you were playing a tank with low penetration, or if the target was simply heavily armored, there was usually a driver's hatch, commander's hatch, or alike to shoot at for increased chances of penning the enemy. But as premium ammunition has become more and more prevalent over the course of the game's lifespan, the newly implemented tanks and new balance changes to older tanks has taken the premium ammo meta into account and strengthened these weak spots into basically just being an extension of the tank's armor. The general armor profile of the current World of Tanks looks something like this: an impenetrable turret with a tiny weak spot, which is either too small to be hit in a real battle situation or too armored to really be considered a weak spot. Then a hull which is either made of paper or is heavily armored with a weak lower plate. There are exceptions, of course. There are tanks which are paper all over, and there are also tanks which are just heavily armored all around with pretty much no weak spots at all. This creates an extremely non-dynamic strategy for eliminating tanks. Obviously, the paper tanks can just be dealt with in any way. They are not really part of the problem. The other two examples are very much so. The first example, the impenetrable turret weak hull one, pretty much encourages people to just take these vehicles into a hull down position where they hide their weak hull and only expose their turret. And the player who do this, do it rightfully so. It's that strategy that makes sense. But what happens then is that they become practically immortal to all incoming fire except HE and artillery. There is really no way for a normal tank on the same flank to deal with this bunker that the opposing player has set up, except pray to RNGs to hit their cupola once in a while or spam HE at their turrets. This is one of the few scenarios where artillery is genuinely helpful if you have one, but in a perfect game, the tanks directly involved should be able to resolve it. I guess you could flank them, but that's only really possible at the second half of a game when more tanks are eliminated and the map is more open. Also, it wouldn't make much sense to do so, as these hull-down brawls are usually played out at key positions that are important to overcome to win the game. And lastly, these hull-down brawls are more often than not duked out between two tanks with the same type of armor profiles, the impenetrable turret weak hull ones. What happens then is basically that an RNG sniping shitfest commences, where both the tanks try to hit the opposing one's weak spot on top of the tank, which is not really possible unless the brawl is played out in very close proximity, and even then it's highly inconsistent. This eventually leads to one of the tanks firing HE, as it's the only round that will deal consistent damage in these scenarios. It's not much damage, but it's definitely more than 0 damage. This was a viable strategy, but I guess Wargaming identified this as a problem, because in one of the recent patches they nerfed HE so that it generally does less than the already minimal damage in these scenarios. It definitely was a problem, don't get us wrong, but the HE wasn't the source of the problem. The source is that the armor profiles of most tanks are just so stale that HE genuinely was the most viable option. Unless Wargaming are actually planning to fix armor later down the line, we genuinely don't understand the HE changes in that regard. And we haven't even talked about the second armor profile example. The tanks that are generally armored all around with practically no weak spots. You know, like the Maus, Type 5 Heavy, AT2, Chrysler, etc. These vehicles are pretty much useless. What? Shouldn't they be extremely overpowered if their armor is that broken? Well, the problem is that their armor is only protected against standard rounds and HE. As soon as anyone loads a premium round, they transform into a huge free damage farm. So the point here is, armor and weak spot are extremely unbalanced and stale in the game and needs to be addressed. This ties in with the power creep topic, because many of the overpowered meta tanks could be nerfed by just increasing their amount of weak spots, or rescaling the already existing ones, or at least just make the hitboxes of the weak spots larger. We are aware that altering a tank's model can be problematic at times, as many tanks are actually based on real-life vehicles. But in these cases, let's take the Chieftain for example, the most prominent case of impenetrable turret weak hull kind of tank. The model is based upon real-life vehicle parts, so altering the model might go against some of Wargaming's design policies, but what they can do instead is extend the hitbox of the cupola, for example. The model does not need to extend, but the hitbox can. Alternatively, give it more weak spots. Make the turret ring or the lower turret penable, or make the gun mantle weak or whatever. Just give it some goddamn weak spots to hit. This can be applied to all relevant vehicles. And in the other case, where the tank is just useless due to premium ammo spam, an armor change can be a buff to many irrelevant tanks. Just make the tank generally impenetrable to most shells, but actually give it proper weak spots that can be penned with standard shells, just like how heavy tanks worked back in the beginning. I think the current KV-5 is the best example of how this armor layout should work. The KV-5 is generally pretty impenetrable, but has huge weak spots that can be exploited, but can also be hidden by an experienced tanker playing the KV-5. This would also solve the issue with the idea of new and rebalanced premium ammo that we discussed earlier. The worry was that if you reduce the alpha damage of premium ammo, some heavily armored tanks would benefit from this in a negative way, as in they would get an unwanted survivability buff due to them generally only being able to be penned by premium ammo, and due to premium ammo now doing less alpha damage, it would take more shells to defeat them. This worry is mostly directed towards vehicles such as the Object 279E and the like. From our perspective, this would generally mostly be a change rather than a buff, as some surfaces could still be penned with standard rounds, which would be the rounds for optimal damage in this proposed change. Generally rehauling the armor profiles of many tanks in the game to contain balanced amount of impenetrable strong areas and easily penetrated weak spots would be very healthy for the game from our perspective, and would also incentivize people to play the game differently and hopefully twist the meta around in an interesting way. The interesting part is that many of the problems about a game might even be completely irrelevant to you personally. Most of the game's problems are mostly prevalent if you are actively grinding through the tech trees, actively playing different types of vehicles, regularly playing higher tier games, and even playing clan wars or ranked battles. But since World of Tanks is tier based, and since there are so many different things to do, collect and accomplish in the game, many people will probably not even see the game's issues as problems. It's only a game. Why you have to be so mad? Because the reality is, most players play World of Tanks because they enjoy the environment, the community, the collection, and just the general tank theme of the game. The game might give you the impression that the goal is to grind towards and conquer tier 10, but a vast majority play the game for free and do not even attempt to go above tier 7, as it's both too expensive or even too competitive. One very good example of this is none other than Edwin E20's dad, Johnny the Rocker. Oh yeah. He has been playing World of Tanks since 2012, and you know, he plays a few games every single night actually, if he has the time. He's barely aware of any of the game's problem because he simply does not care. If he gets an opportunity to play his Hellcat a few games and immerse himself in a tank-focused World War fantasy world, he's very satisfied. He has no need or motivation to unlock high-tier tanks, as he's completely satisfied with playing with his favorite historical tanks around the mid-tiers of the game. Most of the game's popular historical tanks reside in the lower tiers, so obviously tank fans are gonna be more attracted to vehicles they recognize or can identify with, and therefore mostly play or collect tanks in the lower tiers. Of course, the fundamental imbalances are also present in all the tiers, ammunition, overpowered premiums, etc. But this might be something many players do not even care about or realize, as their personal goals are not affected by it. Their goal might be to just grind some experience to unlock the Sherman, or just play a few games with their friends because they just enjoy seeing tanks in motion and duke it out, or just for the social aspect. Let's grab a few beers and play tanks, lads. For them, there might be no such things as overpowered or underpowered premium tanks. There are just tanks on your team and there are tanks on the enemy team. End of story. I remember when I started playing the game back in the day, I couldn't care less about my personal stats or win rate. I saw the Jag Panzer E100 in the tech tree and I was instantly completely sold on it. I made it my personal goal to as quickly as possible grind through the German tank destroyer line so I could play that German beast with 1000 alpha damage as quickly as possible. So through my entire grind of that line, I barely cared about the outcome of the battle. I might have picked up a few things or two about the game as I progressed, but I could not give a flying about if I performed well or not. I was just grinding for the Jag Panzer E100, and this is heavily reflected in my service record. My Jag Tiger, for example, is one of my most played vehicles. My stats in it are atrocious, but I barely remember playing it. Nowadays I think it's a bit of a dirty stain on my stats, because nowadays my personal goals are completely different. Right now I'm trying to collect every single tier 10 tank in the game, but along the tech trees I'm also trying my best to understand every single tank along the way, because ultimately I believe it can make me a better player by having this knowledge. This is probably why I have started to notice and care more about the game's balance, because my approach and personal goals with the game have shifted its focus. But even if you have played a game for as many years as Edwin and I have, your goals might be completely different. Maybe you are just trying to collect all the tier 6 tanks in the game, maybe you're 3 marking, maybe you're trying to boost your stats to get into a clan, maybe you're just grinding credits or bonds so you can purchase that certain vehicle. Or maybe you're just playing a few certain tanks for fun that you just absolutely love playing. Or maybe you just log in once in a while because you absolutely love tanks and enjoy taking part in a community where this interest is shared. The goal of each individual battle in World of Tanks is to win the game by either destroying all the enemy vehicles or capturing the enemy base. But the goal for each individual player in the grand scheme of World of Tanks is never really certain. Maps actually have a huge impact on many of the game's problems, and this might go unnoticed for many players, because ultimately it's the battlefields, the arenas, and the environments that decide if the tanks of the game are overpowered or not, and dictates how you as a player can actually play the game or not. For example, remove all the ridgelines, gravel piles, and hull-down positions of the game, and suddenly the impenetrable turret tanks aren't as good anymore. Remove all the open fields and replace it with small maps with tight city environments, and suddenly light tanks and highly mobile vehicles are useless and super heavy tanks become the meta. Map design really is one of the ground staples that decide how the game is played. And the problem with this is that wargaming's map design philosophy is pretty flawed in our opinion. First of all, the only way to be effective on all maps in the game is to play a tank that has a good balance between armor, firepower and mobility. And only a few certain tanks actually strike that balance, and these tanks usually become the meta tanks. This is why the Chieftain is considered the best tank in the game, as it maintains all of these three balances excellently. Too excellently. So again, this topic ties in with the power creep. A way of nerfing certain vehicles or buffing some could be to redesign the maps, like literally all the maps. If wargaming truly does not want to dig into the stats of certain vehicles because they are afraid of upsetting the wrong people, they could actually redesign the maps of the game to be less beneficial for those certain vehicles. This is obviously a huge undertaking, but it seems to be the only way with wargaming's current mindset. Anyhow, the point here is, all maps in the game are extremely inconsistent in how many playstyles they actually support. If you are a super heavy tank, you probably want to play on Himmelsdorf or Ensk. If you are a sniping tank destroyer or a light tank, you probably want to play on Prokhorovka or Malinovka. So if you as a super heavy tank end up on Malinovka, you better be ready to camp behind a rock the entire game, as this entire map has literally no positions that are viable for you anywhere on the entire frickin' map. Maybe the hill, but it takes about 4 minutes to get there, and in that time the enemy team has probably already claimed the position, or your team has already pushed through it, or most likely you'll get killed trying to get there, as you are a huge slow target on an open map with no cover. This does add to the unpredictability aspect of the game for sure. Pick a specialist vehicle and either you get a monster game or a shit game, but it really falls flat and becomes just unfair when there are still vehicles in the game that can play well on every single map in the game. There are only a few maps in the game that somewhat support every single role in the game. Maps that I can think of on the top of my head are Arctic Region, Lakeville, Pilsen, Kharkiv and El Haluf. There are probably more, and these might not even be accurate for you, as personal playstyle is also a thing that might affect your taste in maps. But the point is, more maps need to be able to support a higher variation of classes to even out the odds for vehicle classes and roles. I think tank destroyers, for example, have been an irrelevant class for almost the game's entire lifetime. There are some exceptions, of course. E25 is overpowered as f***, Stridsvagn 103 is effective as and the Tortoise and T95 are actually very effective in many brawling scenarios. But generally, the tank destroyer class is pretty crippled due to them having pretty few options on the maps themselves. There might be 1 or 2 positions near the spawn where they can camp the entire game, and it's usually very predictable where they are hiding because of the lack of effective locations to be in. So they usually get blind fired or never get to do anything in the game, as opposing players actively avoid engaging these positions due to their predictability. Exactly how to change every map to support every single class and role in the game would take an entire book to explain, so we can't really get into details. But let's take one example at least. Take Ensk. This is personally one of my favorite maps because I'm a fan of heavy tanks with big fat guns, lol, but I can recognize that it's mostly supportive of heavy vehicles and does not support mobility or scouting much. Sniping is also almost impossible due to the entire map being almost completely obstructed with buildings, and there are really no higher ground to shoot down from. Also, the map is so small that you usually get spotted when you fire your gun. What can be done here is make the borders of the map larger or move the borders of the map to incorporate more of the field on the east flank. On this field you could add hills and such where sniping vehicles could stand and overlook the map. The buildings of the map would still probably provide a lot of cover, but at least you could give more vehicle roles a chance. Even though most maps aren't fair to all classes, many of them are at least playable, but many of them also aren't. Let's move over to just the blatantly bad maps. We have mines, where one side always has an advantage due to their side having an easier access to the middle hill, and the team that gets the middle hill first wins the game in pretty much 9 out of 10 scenarios. We have airfield, where each team gets one little camp hill each, and then nothing happens because if you try and advance you die, which usually results in the most passive team winning or the game ending in a draw. We have Berlin, which is disguised as this epic battlefield, but in reality only has one lane on the entire map, where you can realistically advance without dying. The amount of just outright generally bad maps isn't too high, but high enough. But pretty much all the maps contain some bullcrap design flaw that makes it somewhat stale to play on, which ultimately lead to none of the maps being exciting to play on. Personally, I get excited for Himmelsdorf, but that's only because I'm biased towards heavy vehicles, not because it's a balanced map. Most of the game's map design problems come down to wargaming insisting on putting high-risk, high-reward key positions that are obligatory to conquer in order to win the game, and a bunch of dead space where you have to risk your life to be able to advance to the next area of the map. On mines, the key position is to get the middle hill, but to get there, you need to risk your life in the beginning of the game. Sure, it's pretty exciting, I guess, but after you have played the map so many times, you become pretty tired of it, as it's highly inconsistent, especially since one spawn is closer and has a better angle to the hill than the other spawn. So one side just generally has a higher chance of winning. It's just unfair. The funny thing is that wargaming has already solved this problem on another map. In Karelia, the key position is the southeast hill, but this hill has been made more accessible due to having two separate access way on one side and an additional one on the other side. They could literally just take this same formula and apply it to the mines hill and all the other key position hills in the game really. However, we do have a bit of a gripe with this too. The maps where it's one key position that wins the game is pretty stale, as they always play out the same. The meta on such maps is basically, if you conquer the key position, your chances of winning increases to such ridiculously high proportions that engaging any other flank is irrelevant. This can actually be applied to a majority of maps actually, but instead of key positions there are key flanks. There are too many maps where one flank usually just seems useless, where if you win that flank, you don't really gain anything that can impact the outcome of the game in any meaningful way. Arctic region, for example, the bottom banana. A lot of players usually go there because a lot of interesting engagement and plays usually go down there. But if you win that flank, there is just dead space awaiting you at the end for both spawns. And if you try and go over the dead space, you get sniped from base campers, because there are literally always base campers in these positions. The map has so little options that you know that they are always there. So ultimately you don't gain much map advantage from winning the bottom banana. You will obviously pick up a bunch of damage and remove a few enemy vehicles from the game, but you can't advance to the next segment of the map from any side without dying. So what happens is that you secure the flank and then either wait for the enemies to push into your base and go back and defend it, or wait for your team to push through the other flank so you can push simultaneously, or if none of that happens, you'll have to go around the entire map yourself to get to the flank where you can actually reach the enemy base. So realistically, to win a game on this map, you only really need to win the north flank in most cases. Securing the bottom banana is good, but not game winning. This is the problem with the dead space that I mentioned. There are too many positions in the game that just have a bunch of open areas without cover that forces player to sit around and wait for the right opportunity to cross them. I don't know about you, but I think waiting is one of the least entertaining things that exists in this world, and even worse so in video games that are supposed to be fun and take you away from real world problems. Take this flank on Pilsen for example. We have two buildings and some gravel piles for each spawn. The only way to reach the enemy's building is to sit behind a gravel pile and snipe cupolas until the enemy tanks are eliminated, and then push to the other side. But do you remember the problem with the armor profiles in the game? Yep, this is one of those positions. If you do not have a hull down tank here, you are kind of f***ed and just have to wait until the opposition is gone until you can advance. And even if you have a hull down tank, the gameplay here is extremely stale. You could risk your life by rushing over to the other side, but you will most likely die. These kinds of flanks needs alternatives, like two paths on each side where you can flank the enemies instead of just sitting there and hoping for your RNG to be perfect. This also ties in with the accuracy RNG frustration that we mentioned earlier. Just sitting behind a pile, being impenetrable, and just sitting and waiting for the right accuracy RNG is extremely frustrating and boring. It should be one option of many, not the only option. Add flanks around the engagement that let us get closer to the enemy to increase our chances of hitting, decrease accuracy, RNG frustration, and generally just make the maps more fun, dynamic, and satisfying to play on. This frustrating and boring phenomenon is a common design in so many parts of the maps in the game. 2 camps, 1 dead zone between them that prevents advancement until the opposition is gone. You sit around on your ass for so much time without being able to move around the map or make decisions, because each map only has a few viable options that you have to repeat every battle. Maps should reward creativity and intuitive decisions instead of rewarding the same few tactics over and over. And sure, in the end game, where there are only a few tanks remaining and the map really opens up to the player, it does reward creativity. But the majority of the games you will play and the highest amount of playtime you spend on the game will be played out in the startup phase of the game, as in the phase where most tanks are still alive. Because in 9 cases out of 10, this is the phase where the outcome of the game is determined. It's only in very rare cases where the teams are so perfectly balanced that it reaches an endgame climax where you can actually move around freely around the map. And it seems like Wargaming has kind of designed their maps with endgame climax in mind, because when this happens, the maps become much more playable and enjoyable. But as mentioned, this rarely happens, and therefore many maps play out in a very stale way for the most part. We believe this is why 7 vs 7 Brawl is so amazing. By just removing half the players from each team, you open up the maps so much more. So again, the point is, Wargaming's map design philosophy is flawed and needs to be reconsidered. It is nice that Wargaming has now implemented the recon mode where they can receive real player feedback on their maps. However, there honestly needs to be a recon mode for almost every single map that's already in the entire game. A general map redesign is obviously a huge project to go through, so we realistically don't expect much, and many players actually seem to enjoy many of the game's maps. I have heard players who even dislike when Wargaming redesigned maps, because then they have to relearn them. It's honestly a huge and difficult topic that could be discussed for hours, and definitely needs more exploration and attention from the player base. But we wanted to give you guys our standpoint and opinions about the game's maps, as we believe that the maps of the game are a key ingredient for fixing many of the game's problems. Artillery is probably the hottest topic of the entire game, and has always been. Let's talk about its history, why it's so controversial, and our current standpoint of the class. In the beginning of the game, the matchmaker had +- for matchmaking, in some cases even wider than that in the case of light tanks or scout tanks. This was due to the player base being generally smaller and the meta of the game being very different. Wargaming prioritized quick matchmaking, so therefore a wider tier spread was necessary. The problem was, of course, tier 6 heavy tanks had literally no chance against a tier 10 heavy tank, especially since pretty much nobody was firing premium ammunition at this point in time. This is where artillery came in to save the day. Their main job was to focus the top tier vehicles, because they could splash them for either huge damage or moderate amounts of damage, because the thing was, the strongest artillery pieces had around 2000 alpha damage with their HE back then. This seemed fine at first, because literally nobody understood how the game worked. It was kind of a wild west of balance back then. There wasn't even a cap for how many artillery pieces could face each other. There have been games with 15 versus 15 artillery pieces lol, but as the meta progressed and the general understanding of the game improved, the player base recognized artillery's pretty broken characteristics. They could in many cases one-shot kill most of their opponents if they were lucky, and this from a comfortable distance literally at the other side of the map, where they had no risk of receiving damage themselves except for from other artillery pieces. This was especially broken since they were not only limited to targeting top tier tanks, they could of course completely obliterate low tier targets too if they felt like it. It was simply put an unfair class. Wargaming has therefore through the game's lifetime and through its many meta shifts implemented many balance change iterations of artillery in an attempt to make them more fair. They progressively transformed them from broken satellite nuclear strike damage dealers to support fire. Along the way, they implemented a stun mechanic that would incentivize artillery players to try and do damage to several tanks at once, instead of just focusing single targets and making their game games miserable. The stun mechanic received mixed reviews. Some loved it. Finally, I can actually receive hits from artillery without getting one-shot killed. And some hated it. I would rather die when I get hit from artillery than being crippled for 30 seconds. The thing is that their damage output was reduced, but their rate of fire and accuracy was increased. So what happened instead was that artillery became a constant presence and a never-ending barrage of stunning. The stun mechanic would stay, however, and would shape some of the game's in-game missions, where you can unlock exclusive mission reward tanks. Artillery was no near from being overpowered anymore though, except a few specific ones, but generally they were a pretty underwhelming class. And even though their general performance was pretty subpar, the hate towards them only continued to grow more and more. They were still unfair, they could still shoot across the map from a safe distance, they could stun you and cripple your tank, knock out modules and crew members, and sometimes even do high outputs of damage if they hit a weak spot. Their intended role in the game seemed to have faded away to only be this negative, annoying class that you only played to complete the missions for the reward tanks. Wargaming insisted that they were needed to force tanks out of campy positions and prevent tanks from clumping into groups. The player base would generally not agree though, even though artillery have always had its group of fans. We do acknowledge that artillery is a very nice and relaxed class for not so try-hard players. We know people who absolutely love World of Tanks, but are not skilled enough for the normal tanks of the game. Artillery then becomes a nice solution for them to take part in the action from a safe distance. So we can see how artillery has a place in the game. Wargaming are undoubtedly perfectly aware of artillery's non-popular status in the game. Proof of this is that there haven't been any new artillery premium tanks since the British nation many years ago. Also, they have never ever introduced any tier 8 premium artillery pieces yet. Low. Eventually, in one of the latest updates of the game, 1.13, they got a new nerf. At surface level, it just looked like a rework that would incentivize more skillful play from artillery players and make them a bit more fair. They remade the artillery shell system to include the standard stun shell, a new HE shell that does not inflict stun but does more damage, and an AP shell that has very high pen and moderate and consistent damage. All the different shells would also have different shell arcs and travel times. They also implemented new artillery mechanics, such as bright and visible shell tracers that would help non-artillery tanks to understand the artillery's location and dictate where their own most effective positioning should be. A new skill that let tanks know if artillery has an incoming shell towards you, and small icons on the map that let you know if artillery has just fired at a position on the map. However, due to even lower damage output on the stun shells, which most players still use because of the stunning missions and just general reliability, artillery was indirectly nerfed instead of just reworked. And this is where we are currently. Now, we are extremely biased against artillery. We have hated it since day one. Or at least I have hated it since day one. Edwin maybe from day 3, lol. The first time I ever got hit by artillery back in 2011, I got so extremely dissatisfied with it that I decided to not play and promote such a toxic class. And I have never picked them up ever since, so I still have 0 games as kind of a testament or statement against my unapproval of this class in the game. So for me and for Edwin, who have actively whined about this class being unfair, annoying and bad for the game since the dawn of time, a nerf to artillery is not something we are unhappy about. However, we do think Wargaming has failed with their intended mission, because they have actively tried to integrate artillery with the rest of the game in a fair and engaging way for almost 10 years now. I once said that if Wargaming finally managed to make artillery fair and balanced, I will actually play it. But just nerfing them is definitely not fair and balanced. Now they are just bad and nobody wants to play them. If the goal was just to nerf artillery and make people play them less, they could have just limited the cap of them in the matchmaker to like 2 or even 1, like in ranked. They didn't have to ruin their performance even more. They just had to reduce their presence to not be as annoying. In a perfect world though, their presence should not have to be decreased and just be a fair and balanced class in of itself. But how do you make artillery completely fair and balanced and fun and engaging to both play as and against? We have made videos discussing this in the past, but honestly we are not entirely sure. It's mostly Wargaming that insists that their inclusion in the game is vital, so they should have the right answers themselves, right? Also, the left is still f***ing broken, nerf plus. The next controversial type of vehicles in this list. Currently, wheeled vehicles are sort of a subclass incorporated in the light tank class. Let's go through their history and our takes about them. They were included in the game a few years ago for the purpose of being a new, exciting and more active way to play a scout tank. Usually light tanks or scout tanks take more of a passive scouting role. Carefully maneuver to a bush without getting spotted by enemy tanks, and then proceed to basically just sit there and uncover enemy tanks nearby, and then at a relevant time maneuver to the next concealed position, rinse and repeat. Occasionally light tanks will take an active scouting role depending on the tank and the map, but these new wheeled vehicles would focus more on an active role. Their base view range would be relatively low in comparison to other scouts, but to compensate for this, they got insane mobility because instead of tracks, they got wheels. Other light tanks might reach speeds around 60 to 70 kph, but these new wheeled vehicles would reach speeds up around 90 kph, and the ability to turn so fast and sharp that not even a fighter pilot would survive the G-forces that the wheeled vehicles can push. Wargaming also introduced a bunch of unique mechanics and characteristics for these vehicles. They would have two modes to switch between with the X key. One mode with higher maneuverability but average speed, and one mode with lower maneuverability but turbo speed. They also received an improved auto-aim. The normal auto-aim that's located on your right mouse button only locks onto an enemy target if you hover the mouse directly over an enemy vehicle and receive an outline. Wargaming identified this as a problem for wheeled vehicles. As they move so incredibly fast, they would not be able to auto-aim very easily as the targets move past them too quickly, and they wanted to incorporate this sort of drive-by playstyles into this vehicle. So the new improved auto-aim for these vehicles exclusively would let you auto-aim onto an enemy vehicle by just having the mouse in roughly the same vicinity as the target. They were also planned to have another mechanic that would let you charge into full speed from a standstill. However, this mechanic would be scrapped. The Tier 10 was also initially supposed to reach speeds about 100 kph, but this got nerfed to 90. A final thing they gave wheeled vehicles was high penetration, high explosive. All of these characteristics combined were initially met with hype and excitement, but also with cautious optimism and skepticism. It would take a while before this skepticism would be justified. These vehicles had very unique driving physics, so it took a while to get used to them, but when people learned how to play these vehicles, they quickly made their mark in history as annoying clown cars. The problems about wheeled vehicles are a rabbit hole of phenomenons. We can start with the most simple one. They are fast. Lol. We have a very wide spectrum of mobility in World of Tanks. The TOG-2 goes 13 kph and the T100LT goes at 70 kph. Speed variety has always been a thing in World of Tanks, and it's nice because it caters to different preferred playstyles. But the speed difference between vehicles has never been so large that they feel mismatched, and this is where the wheeled vehicles come in. They are just so incredibly much faster than the rest of the opposition. I mean, the fastest wheeled vehicle is 20 kph faster than the fastest tank ever before it, the T100LT. The wheeled vehicles are so far away from literally the rest of the tanks in the game when it comes to mobility that it's almost as if they are playing a different game of their own. And in a game like World of Tanks, where we have such things as aim time and accuracy RNG, trying to take these vehicles out is incredibly frustrating and annoying. But we can get behind this aspect of wheeled vehicles this far. After all, they are meant to be really close up and personal around the enemy team because of the lack of view range, so their mobility is basically their only way of defending themselves and should therefore be very extreme as to not make the class useless. However, fully kitted out with view range boosting crews and equipment, you can still reach view ranges that are high enough to avoid getting very close to the enemies. So more often than not, when you encounter a wheeled vehicle, it will not be a close-up encounter. It will be halfway across the map going 90 kph and spotting you and your team. And you will in many cases not even see the wheeled vehicle that is spotting you, because of the insane camouflage that they also have. The only way to reliably take the vehicle out in these long-range scenarios is to have a super accurate gun with high shell velocity, like a Stridsvagn 103 or a Leopard 1, or another wheeled tank chasing after it. And even here you might get screwed over by accuracy RNG, and even worse, by your ping. If you don't have a perfect internet connection, dealing with wheeled vehicles is impossible in a game such as World of Tanks. We do believe that this is an additional factor to their annoyance. Since World of Tanks is generally such a slow-paced game, a large group of people don't really mind playing the game with higher ping, as the pace creates a much more forgiving experience than other games. However, these wheelie boys just require you to have a perfect ping in order to hit them. Then we come to the next set of problems. Even if you hit the vehicle with a shell, there is a very high probability that you will only hit the vehicle's wheels, as they cover a majority of those vehicles' profiles. And the wheels count as spaced armor and not part of the tank. So this only results in knocking out said wheel and not inflicting any damage to the tank. But shouldn't that be good? If a wheel gets knocked out, shouldn't the entire vehicle just flip over or slowly come to a stop? Nope. The only thing that happens when a wheel is taken out is that the vehicle in question loses a part of its speed. You need to knock out all the 4 wheels to make it stop completely. And if you have played World of Tanks for a while, you will know that this literally never happens. So in theory, you can make wheeled vehicles stop completely and then kill them there, but in practice, it's impossible. Because what happens when a wheel or two gets knocked out is that the player controlling the vehicle just repairs the wheels with a repair kit on the move. This stands in stark contrast to regular tracked tanks, which upon getting just one track destroyed will immediately get immobilized and will in most cases have to spend their repair kit immediately, when wheeled vehicles can just keep going and then repair the wheel while on the move, and even wait for a better moment to repair and not do it right there and now. And it's not like you can actually reliably hit the wheels either. These vehicles are so incredibly fast that you only focus on hitting anything really. If you hit the wheel, it's usually by accident. But the deal is, hitting the wheel should be a good thing, but since the vehicle just keeps moving without receiving damage, you just become frustrated. This also stands in stark contrast with the normal tracked light tanks. If you manage to hit their track, they usually become immobilized and killed by someone else because of it, and then you receive some assistance damage, so you get rewarded for hitting that small pixel shot. While with wheeled vehicles, you get rewarded absolutely nothing for taking out their wheels, unless you manage to take out their 4th wheel so they get completely immobilized, which literally never happens. It's a feature that I know exists within the game, but I have never seen it happen in a battle, no joke. Never. The next problem is their firepower. For some reason, they have one of the highest accuracies on the move in the game. This combined with the improved auto-aim and their high penetration, high explosive makes them incredibly infuriating. They rarely hit hard, but they do hit a lot on the move from 300 plus meters away, going 90 kph, and if they can't pen you, they just load their high penetration, high explosive and always do some damage and always hit, relatively speaking. This combination of extreme mobility, good firepower, high camo and good view range makes them not only extremely annoying, but one of the best vehicles in the game. The tier 10 EBR 105 is often said to be one of the best tanks in the game, and they are without doubt the best scouts in the game, rendering all the other scout tanks in the game in most scenarios irrelevant in comparison. Because the wheeled vehicles are not only excellent active scouts, they can also do the passive scout role very well if they feel like it, as well as being able to be damage dealers, which many other light tanks lack. So in short, wheeled vehicles are too good, unfair, annoying, and makes an entire class of vehicles irrelevant. Also, due to how much of an impact they have in every battle they are in, if one team gets a skilled player in a wheeled vehicle and the other team gets a player who just suicide rushes into the enemy base and dies, the game is pretty much settled right there already. Then there's the other side of the same coin. Sometimes these suicide rush players gets away with it. Because of the class's generally unfair characteristics, they become a highly forgiving class to play. So the class both excels competitive players into new levels of unkillable, but also gives lowly experienced players the opportunity to achieve the same results with no effort or thought behind their actions at all. Or they just go and die. This extremely high frequency of inconsistency elevates their annoyance to even higher levels. We have heard the argument, well, just aim better bro, just lead your shells more carefully, the tank has so little HP, you only have to hit a few times. Well, if the game would contain no accuracy RNG, that might actually work. But we have already mentioned why we believe removing accuracy RNG would be bad, so not an option, and I'm sorry but it doesn't work. Maybe if you literally only play the Leopard 1. Maybe, I don't know. Wargaming has actually done some positive changes to the wheeled vehicles. They have increased how much speed is lost per wheel hit, and they have also nerfed their high explosive and made their wheels pennable with HE. These are all excellent changes, but unfortunately there is still no reason to play any other scout tank over wheeled vehicles, and they are still highly annoying. Something more needs to be done. What they should do is either nerf their base view range even more, or set a cap on how much view range they can have. This way they will have to advance much closer into enemy territory before spotting any enemy vehicles, and therefore give the enemies a higher chance to shoot them back and damage them. Remember, the closer you are, the higher the chance to hit and pen your enemy. This will also give other light tanks more room to shine, as their view range would be superior. Another fix would be, just like with the tier 10 Polish medium, the wheel tank should have to go to a standstill in order to switch between speed modes with the X key, as currently they can switch while going full speed. And just as the Polish medium, the general gun parameters should also decrease when in the turbo mode. This way active decisions need to be made when trying to either scout or deal damage, instead of just rushing in brainless for results. Also, when one wheel breaks, the entire vehicle should get immobilized, just like with any other vehicle in the game. Wheel tanks should also be considered their own class for the matchmaker, like in ranked, and as mentioned in the class discussion earlier. Finally, they could also nerf the overall accuracy of the vehicle. All of these changes do not need to stack up to balance the class, but any of the options, at least one of them, should be considered. With the art, we mean the visuals, the sound design, and the music. World of Tanks is generally pretty grey, brown, and dark in its visuals. It's going for a pretty gritty and rough aesthetic. For some people, this might be extremely off-putting, especially considering that the first thing you will notice about anything is how it looks. When you see a video game on YouTube, you won't really notice how the game feels or if it's fun to play or not. You will notice how it looks, and people will have varying preferences when it comes to what kind of art styles and graphical designs they like. But for what World of Tanks is aiming for, they are nailing it. Any game that takes inspiration from World War or global conflict shouldn't really have a happy or light-hearted graphical style, but there is a sense of beauty in that grittiness. The vehicle models of the game are highly detailed and very satisfying to just look at, and the general environments of the game really takes you to another place. However, there is also contrast to the gritty World War theme of the game. Some maps have lush green forests and plains, there are pretty oceans and lakes, and stark deserts and glaciers. In recent years, wargaming have also embraced that World of Tanks is not just a historical throwback, but also a video game that is meant to be fun and enjoyable. So we have wacky commanders including Chuck Norris, Santa Claus, Halloween-style commanders, unicorns, and all sorts of wacky stuff. And we have vehicle skins that come in all shapes and forms, everything from apocalypse-themed ones to straight-up memes. Some can definitely be too much though, but I think we can all agree that there is a rich variety of visual content in the game that is just a thrill to discover. And there will be something for everybody's taste. And in the end, if you do not like the contrasting styles of the game, you can turn them off by disabling non-historical elements. The sound effects of the game are also highly satisfying, and we even want to go to the length to claiming they are iconic in modern pop culture. The spotting sound effect and the Sixth Sense sound effect is for us World of Tanks gamers just as impactful as the Super Mario jump sound and the Zelda treasure sound effect. And then we have the gun sounds, which are just so incredibly thick and oh so epic. The first time I fired my gun with the Jagdpanzer E100, I almost lost my pants in the process. There are a lot of intricate sound effects in the game that just seals the deal in the World of Tanks package. But when it comes to sound in general, there is nothing more epic than the game's soundtrack. This is something that players seldom talk about, and it's mostly due to the music not being very prevalent inside the game itself. It plays in the beginning and in the end of each battle, and most players turn the volume down to listen to their own playlists or something similar. But we want to highlight that the World of Tanks soundtrack is really epic. A few years back, the soundtrack got a complete remake, and it sounds extremely majestic, and it's even dynamic to what happens in game too. We do highly recommend you to take a listen to any of the songs on YouTube. We once thought about doing a top 10 World of Tanks music tracks video, but ultimately decided that nobody would watch such a video. However, we will do it here and now, baked into this video, lol, in a quick compilation. So here's AwesomeEpicGuys top 10 World of Tanks music tracks. Comment if you agree or disagree. Number 10. Karelia. Number 9. Pilsen. Number 8. Empire's Border. Number 7. Live Oaks. Number 6. Himmelsdorf. Number 5. Mannerheim Line. Number 4. Mountain Pass. Number 3. Highway. Number 2. Kharkov. Number 1. Studzianki. So what do you think? Anyhow, if you haven't had the time before to appreciate the music of World of Tanks, go check out the soundtrack on YouTube. It's all up there and it's very nice. Generally, the art of World of Tanks is something we believe everybody is aware of, but are not aware that they appreciate. So the crew system in World of Tanks is quite an important key aspect of the game. The crew dictates a lot of what you can do or not do in the game. By playing the game with the same crew, that crew will progressively gain experience and can eventually learn a set of skills and perks along the way. These skills vary from decreasing the time to repair broken modules on the tank, to increasing your view range and getting a flashy little light bulb on your screen that indicates that an enemy has spotted your position and you better move. The crew system has always worked perfectly fine, but we do want to highlight some minor things that could be tweaked with. Firstly, we do believe that it can be quite a confusing system to learn. I remember when I started playing the game back in the day, I barely bothered to train my crews because it was too much of a hassle. There's just so much retraining and moving to barracks and finding the correct crewmates in the list and making sure you pick the correct skills, or else you need to retrain them again and potentially waste a bunch of credits in the process. But the crew is such a vital part to making your tank work properly. If your crew is bad, the tank will perform worse in a lot of parameters, so you want to take your time and make your crew right. But it could definitely be easier. We believe that some interface changes could ease up this process. There are just too many steps and menus that you get lost in, and could probably be simplified into having everything available to you with just 1 or 2 clicks from the garage. Equipment 2.0 did a good job at this, with a more clear and easy to comprehend interface that is difficult to get lost in. The second problem with the crew system is that many skills or perks feel redundant and not worth picking unless you already have all the other skills. Adrenaline Rush, for example, is an interesting concept. You get a reload boost when your HP is below 10%, but it's seldom useful and therefore never picked. This could just be fixed by increasing the limit to 20% or something in those lines. Intuition was a perk that was extremely redundant before, but which they recently fixed. Before, if you decided to switch between shell types, it had a low chance of making you instantly switch between them if you were loaded, but this chance was so low that nobody wanted to take the risk, ultimately leading to nobody using the perk. They fixed this perk into now just decreasing the reload time significantly between switching shells when loaded. A really good change. More of these kinds of changes would be really healthy in our opinion for more irrelevant skills such as Eagle Eye, Designated Target, Call for Vengeance, Signal Boosting, and the list goes on. The last problem with the crew is that some perks such as Sixth Sense have become such staple and essential perks that not picking them is deemed foolish. Sixth Sense in particular should be incorporated as a default mechanic into the game, and really all the skills kind of needs to be reworked so that you as a player have more of a dynamic choice rather than an obvious set of essential that you train on literally all your crews in the same order every time. You either know the system and exploit it, or don't know the system and get punished for it. There's no middle ground. The selection and order of skills for each individual crew becomes pretty much identical every time due to only a few of the skills being relevant. Give more choices and preferences to the player, just like with Equipment 2.0. Now, we all know that Wargaming wants to change all of this. Wargaming proposed Crew 2.0 and their response to this new system was mixed. Lol. One good thing is that they want to incorporate Sixth Sense, Mentor, and the sound detection / triangulation skill as default skills that you will have from the get-go, which is something that we actually asked for. They also wanted to merge all crew members into one unit, which would ease up the process of training crews. This will also avoid crew non-compatibility issues, when for example you have a 4-man crew that suddenly turns into a 3-man crew in the next tank in the tech tree. We do like the idea of this concept, but the rest of the rework is just too much. They are completely rehauling the entire skill and perk system, replacing and rebuilding old ones, and adding a copious amount of new ones, as well as converting unique crew members into instructors who basically just boost your crew in certain ways. At the point of recording this video, this proposal has not yet been implemented, but we would not be surprised if it does. A similar system exists in World of Warships, and in that game, thanks to the crew being just one unit, they can sell the crews more proficiently in the premium store. In World of Tanks, players wouldn't really be interested in buying individual crew members, so Wargaming is fixing this problem by merging the crews into one. This is probably a huge business stunt for Wargaming to earn more money, as they have recognized that crews sell well in World of Warships. As this new system has not been implemented yet, we won't go into much detail as we don't want to discuss something that potentially won't happen, but we do want to say that we generally disapprove of it. The new skills involved are too convoluted and feels like they are inspired by some Magic the Gathering card game with a bunch of conditions, actions, and weird powers that just feels outlandish to the World of Tanks formula, as well as feeling a bit too broken and will probably affect the World of Tanks meta in ways that literally nobody asked for. And on top of that, the grind for a viable crew would become absurdly long with the new system. In the current crew system, roughly 3 million experience would be enough for a decent crew, while with the new proposed one it would require roughly 60 million experience. And this would make the game extremely pay to win, as nobody realistically would be able to play that much without spending some real life money. And even worse, you would probably only have time and resources for one single crew to train, as the process of training a single crew would take ages, and this would limit you to only playing a few single tanks that are compatible with said crew. The game would become extremely stale because of this. Call us purists or afraid of change, but compare it to Equipment 2.0 for example. This was just an extension and general balanced improvement to an existing aspect of the game, and it turned out great. This is something we would actually like from Crew 2.0, an overhaul of the existing system, not a completely new one. If you have played World of Tanks for a lengthy amount of time, you have probably given one of World of Tanks' more competitive modes a chance. The most prevalent ones are Ranked and Clan Wars, and these are the ones that we will talk about. First off though, we want to clarify our personal relationship to competitive World of Tanks. We believe that due to the nature of how World of Tanks works, with all its RNG and similar elements of chance, the random maps, the random teammates that have different ambitions and goals, makes the World of Tanks experience. The game thrives and shines as a random battle game. This is roughly where 9 out of 10 players will spend the most of their time playing this game. We don't have specific data, but roughly estimated 9 out of 10, including ourselves, as we think this is where the most fun of World of Tanks is located. This also means that only the remaining 1 out of 10 players will really be affected by what we are going to discuss here. Of course, since we mostly play random battles ourselves, as that's where we believe that the game really shines, our knowledge on competitive World of Tanks won't be among the top. But the problem still stands, and we believe that they are very important to be addressed, as competitive play is not necessarily something a majority will take part of, but at least a lot of players will watch on YouTube and Twitch, etc. And if that scene is hampered by problems, less people will watch it, and then less traffic will be present for the game. It is healthy for a video game to have a strong esports scene, which World of Tanks has always lacked. With that said, let's begin with Clan Wars. Let's discuss what it is first and then clarify its problems. To take part in Clan Wars, you will firstly need a clan. This can be quite difficult to achieve. Either you create one yourself if you are confident enough in your clan commanding skills and your ability to recruit decent people for the clan, or you try and find an established clan that is well suited for you. Now, some clans are just designed to be hubs or communities and are not necessarily out for global domination, because the general goal of Clan Wars is to overtake certain key points across a world map, to own as many unprofitable provinces on the map as possible. To overtake a new piece of land, you will have to challenge a respective owner clan of said land into a battle of World of Tanks. If you are attacking a province, trying to steal it from an owner clan, you will be at a disadvantage, as the defending clan only requires a draw to keep the province, while you need to win, which usually results in turtle tactics from province owners. The difference from random battles here is that the map is not random. It's known before the battle. You choose your own tank lineup from scratch, you choose what players get to play, and there are certain consumables and equipment pieces that enable unique abilities. The enemy lineup is completely hidden and gets revealed as individual tanks get spotted, also known as Fog of War. And finally, it's isolated to tier 10. Holding land will benefit in resources such as gold, clan boosters and bonds that go into the clan fund. So holding land will make you a more attractive and respectable clan. The funds will also be split individually to clan members. Also, being at the top of the clan leaderboard of certain Clan Wars campaigns will usually result in a unique vehicle reward. One of these vehicles was the T95/FE4201 Chieftain. And this is where the problems begin. To get into a top clan, you of course need to be an incredibly skilled player. That's pretty obvious. But the most competitive clans will put other requirements for you as a player as well before you can join their clan. You will probably need a Chieftain tank and a Bond turbo, plus any other future essential equipment pieces that Wargaming will force into the game as carrots to make people play bad modes. We have mentioned the Chieftain in earlier topics as well, as the proclaimed best tank in the game, but it is in Clan Wars where the Chieftain really tops the charts in bullshittery. We'll talk about the Bond Turbo and what it is later. In the highest level of Clan Wars, it is not uncommon to see two teams of 15 versus 15 Chieftains. You'll often see an EBR-15 wheeled vehicle in the mix to handle scouting as well. Sure, there are some other tanks in the mix too, Object 279E, CS63, 50B, STB-1, Stridsvagn 103, Object 907 and Manticore to name a few, that are used in very specific scenarios. The problem remains that most clan leaders won't pick a player who lacks the Chieftain, as it's essential for most battles. The Chieftain is so incredibly meta in Clan Wars, which makes both playing and watching Clan Wars extremely stale. Now, one argument here could of course be, since everybody is playing the same tank, it will be more balanced that way. And and will really emphasize on individual player and team skill. This is completely true, but the problem is that many players do not enjoy playing the chieftain, and while others do, we can imagine that playing the same tank over and over in a game that contains hundreds of vehicles will eventually become repetitive. Before the chieftain was introduced, different clans would usually experiment with different individual tank lineups on every single map in the game, but afterwards more and more maps would just incorporate more and more 15 chieftain lineups, eventually turning a majority of the maps to chieftain playgrounds. We highlighted in earlier topics that player choice, variety and unpredictability are key flavors that make World of Tanks enjoyable. The rules of Clan Wars are of course a bit different, and there will undoubtedly generally be less variety as more optimal plays and strategies will be necessary to win. But to narrow it down to just one single tank in a tier where there are about 60 other options is just ridiculous. This is not emphasizing on the player's choice. This is the player's necessity. The chieftain has become a mandatory element that you need in order to be competitive in Clan Wars. So therefore many top clans require you to own a chieftain in order to be able to join their clan. So how do you get a chieftain then? Well, there's the next problem. You can't. Lol. The last time you could get a chieftain was in the summer campaign 2020 if you reached high enough on the leaderboards or purchased one for a ridiculous amount of bonds in a Clan Wars auction that was only available during these campaigns. Bonds is the only resource in the game which is only available through playing the game only. Me personally managed to collect roughly 30k of these bonds in maybe a 2-year period. To buy the chieftain you would need around maybe 40k bonds on EU. Some reports claim that they got it for as high as around 70k to 100k bonds as well. We can't really pinpoint the exact numbers, but the point is you would need a shit ton of bonds, and these bonds take a real grind to get. After the latest couple of Clan Wars campaigns, Wargaming recognized how toxic the tank was for the game and decided to not give it out again. As to avoid getting any backlash from the players who had been grinding for this particular tank for potentially years, they decided to not nerf the tank, just to not sell it again. But this of course created an even bigger backlash, as the new clans who wanted to get into the Clan Wars scene simply couldn't keep up. Because in order to stay competitive, you need a chieftain, which you cannot get. What's quite ironic though, even if they would give out the chieftain in any future campaigns, in order to get one, you would need to land high in the leaderboards, and in order to do that, you would need a chieftain. It's just an endless circle of nonsense. And ultimately it leads to only a few certain clans remaining at the top, and there is no way to break into the sphere without having a clan of chieftain tanks. And this situation has been made even more ridiculous due to the new recent inclusion of the Bond Turbo. Let's break it down. So in the game there is an equipment piece called Turbo Charger, which increases the speed of the tank it's put on by a few %. It's a pretty funny tool to make like super heavy tanks go a bit faster, making speedy tanks go even faster, although pretty unnoticeable so. But it's generally a very neat addition to the game that is available to everybody for credits in the in-game store. But then Wargaming introduced the Bond Turbo, which is the turbocharger but with an increased percentage of speed and horsepower as an exclusive reward for a game mode that was only available for a few weeks. This game mode was the test season of Ranked Mode Summer 2021, and we'll talk more about that mode later, but the general consensus is that the Ranked Mode is generally toxic and boring. So to get this Bond Turbo, you'd have to grind through this painful and infuriating mode, which only highly competitive players do. But why is the Bond Turbo so impactful for Clan Wars then? In Clan Wars, the map philosophy that we talked about earlier is not as problematic. In Clan Wars, most maps are just different in how you tackle them. I'm sure there are major map imbalances for Clan Wars as well, but our experience is that they are easier to play around because you play as a collective force instead of just an individual player surrounded by random teammates. In Clan Wars, constant communication between between all players, and clever positioning and distribution of players to certain locations is key. But to be able to conquer the certain key positions, you will need to get to them first. And in a meta where literally all the players are playing the same tank, every slight difference in individual tank parameters can make a huge difference. This is why the Bond Turbo makes Clan Wars even more ridiculous, because it will be a necessity to own it, to just be slightly faster than the opposition, or rather to be as fast as the opposition, because every top clan will have a Bond Turbo on their chieftains. And currently, the Bond Turbo is also another impossible item to get, even further increasing the gap between the top clans and the rest of the clans. The only way to get it, as mentioned, was to get it through the test season of the ranked mode, which is now over. So how about we talk about the ranked mode, which will inevitably return, and how it's also a shitstorm. The ranked mode was implemented to the game many years ago for the purpose of letting individual players partake in a competitive game mode where being part of a clan was not necessary, where good players could showcase their individual skill level of the game against players with similar levels of experience in a random battle format. World of Tanks random battle mode has always pitched random players against random players, so this new mode would let true hardcore players finally show off their might against level-headed tryhards. How the mode works is that it is exclusively located at tier 10, with a specific rotation of maps handpicked by Wargaming. You play a normal battle of World of Tanks, but depending on your performance you receive a unique set of points known as chevrons that are exclusive to this mode. The amount of chevrons you receive depends on the amount of experience you gain compared to your teammates within one battle. What's unique to the mode is that you will gain extra experience if you perform your tank's intended role correctly. An E100, for example, will gain experience from blocking damage. This is actually pretty neat as it rewards varying preferred playstyles. Up until now the system sounds pretty good indeed, but here is where the problems start. The ranked mode is only available in limited seasons, and in them you try and earn new ranks to eventually reach the very top, where you'll unlock a juicy reward, often in the shape of a tank. In the last season of Ranked, it was the Bond Turbo as mentioned. In order to gain a rank, you need to accumulate enough chevrons. However, at the end of each battle, you will only actually receive chevrons if you place high enough on your team in experience earn. When winning a game, the top players will receive more chevrons, the middle performers less chevrons, and the worst performers no chevrons. And if you lose, literally only the top player will receive chevrons, and the rest will maintain or lose chevrons. This chevron system creates an extremely toxic meta in Ranked, because you will constantly experience a fear of losing chevrons, and because of this, players play more passively as to secure a top player position in case they lose the game. The mentality of the mode becomes trying to not lose chevrons instead of trying to gain ones. Aside from playing extremely passively to ensure damage is farmed for experience, the players play extremely selfishly as well. Since only the top players will get chevrons if you lose, you are not only competing against the enemies, but also your own team in a team-based game. The idea is that you are supposed to go up against players of similar skill level, but in reality it's just a bunch of frustrated, selfish tryhards trying to win against a flawed system to gain a stupid reward that Wargaming is forcing to go through this experience because of the rewards being mandatory for other competitive modes, Clan Wars as mentioned. Another silly thing about Ranked is that the current Ranked matchmaker really only cares about putting you inside a battle with a same level enemy on the enemy team. The levels of the other tankers on both teams are usually not as important. For example, you can play in Division 2 or 3, but still play with players who have completed the event and are playing in leagues, simply because there aren't enough players playing the mode. There will also be plenty of examples where you face an extremely powerful player who just started grinding later than you and will now crush you even though you are both on the same level, and the other way around, which completely nullifies the purpose because of a ranked competitive game mode. This problem is amplified because of the season-based structure. In pretty much all other competitive games or games with an esports scene, their respective ranked game mode is a permanently available mode, where you don't have to rush through the ranks to get some silly reward. Instead, you are motivated by improving as a player and not materialistic rewards. Maybe a fancy badge by the side of your name at max to showcase your skill, while in World of Tanks, a badge by the side of your name is considered by many the lowest level of reward. It has become an unhealthy common practice to give out over-the-top rewards to motivate World of Tanks players. Wargaming, if you really need to incentivize your player to play your modes by giving out some mandatory over-the-top reward, then maybe there's a problem with your modes. This is a game, and games are supposed to be fun, not a part-time job. If it's not fun, why bother? Well, how do you fix ranked? We don't think Wargaming can make ranked, as it is right now, into a good mode. Wargaming have actually made some positive changes to the mode, like removing the ability to play ranked rewards such as the chieftain within the mode, limiting the presence of wheel tanks and artillery, and cutting it from 15 versus 15 to 10 versus 10, etc. But at this point, we feel like they are just polishing a turd. The problem in essence is that you are competing against your own team in a team-based game. However, here's a list of other problems that make the mode just unable to be a good mode. Bonus battles. Even though it encourages a mix of tanks in the matchmaker, it creates a huge frustration for players who just want to play through the mode fast. The game punishes players who grind through the mode fast and play the mode a lot in a few days, and rewards players who grab their dailies in just a few battles in their best tanks and log out and wait for the next day. Indirectly, it rewards players who play the mode less. For example, Edwin E20, who is not really famous for being a top World of Tanks player, and is more known for being a memer or a professional idiot. He managed to get a higher chevron percentage than famous top World of Tanks performers such as Skill4, Daki and Isne, just because Edwin played 3 to 4 bonus battles per day and nothing more, while others just want to grind through the mode quickly and attempt to claim their doubles in worse performing tanks, which ultimately results in worse average chevron gain. Repetitive tank lineups. Even though bonus battle are a thing, you will see the same meta tanks over and over again, especially in the higher divisions. It's just a grind. If you reach the top, there is very little that incentivizes people to challenge themselves further. The mode is designed to be a grind to the top, and when they reach it, they stop and never touch the mode again until the next season. Not even good players like the mode. The ranked mode is literally a shit mode for good players to force themselves to play for the rewards alone. If they would remove all the rewards such as the unique tanks, bonds and unique equipment pieces and replace them with more decoratory rewards such as medals, camos and the like, the mode would probably die instantly, because nobody really wants to play the mode. It honestly just sucks. A completely new ranked system is necessary, preferably a permanent ranked mode. We discussed this in more depth in our tier 10 is bad video towards the end of the video. Check it out in the card above or in the video description. Also, as it is right now, it seems as if ranked is just another mode to squeeze credits and money out of players, both during and before and after in preparation for the next ranked. For example, they introduced a new Czech Heavy line just before the last season of Ranked, and as it turns out, the tier 10 Czech Heavy was highly meta in Ranked. Imagine how much money Wargaming earned from players converting free experience just in order to get that vehicle for Ranked. Regarding the Clan Wars situation, we think Wargaming's biggest mistake is literally doing nothing to improve the chieftain problem. We don't think there is one single solution that will make everybody happy, but they need to at least try. Maybe present a selection of solutions. For example, resell the chieftain, rebalance the chieftain, limit the presence of chieftains or reward tanks to different fronts with different levels of rewards in different fronts, etc. and etc. And let the community or the relevant players vote for the solution. Doing nothing is literally making everybody upset. Everybody. We have been addressing a lot of the game's flaws by now, and by now it might sound like we genuinely hate World of Tanks or something. This is absolutely not the case. We believe that World of Tanks is one of the most unique video game experiences on the market. Sure, it has many things stacked against it. The game genre is niche, the whole tank setting is niche, the community never agrees on anything, wargaming themselves don't have a great reputation due to their free-to-play model and the business practices that comes with it. And of course, it has an overabundance of gameplay problems, which is why we made this video. But it also has a lot of strength and unique flavor, which is also why we made this video. The fact is, all modern competitive video games have their fair share of problems. Go to any well-established content creator of any competitive game, and I'm sure they will be complaining about something. It's just how these games transform due to the ever-demanding force of video game consumerism and competition. But if it was all bad, we're pretty sure most of these games would be dead a long time ago, and we wouldn't even be talking about it. And in the case of World of Tanks, say what you will of wargaming, but keeping a single video game relevant for over 10 years is a feat only a handful of video games has ever achieved. So they do deserve some credit for their actions. We as human beings really like to label things as inherently bad or good, when reality is often a mix of both, a grayscale. And this is also where most of the modern competitive video games land too. It's a mixed blend of problems and benefits that constantly fight each other. And this is probably why players stick around and get so passionate about the games they play. They see both the best sides and the worst sides of their games, and so they keep gold digging within these problem-infested games for that juicy, satisfying experience that they know is in there. And this is where we are right now in World of Tanks. We have so many problems that aren't even isolated to themselves, but are connected to almost every aspect of the game. Solving the puzzle to fixing World of Tanks into being the most optimal game is a passion and discussion that keeps going and keeps evolving through the lifetime of World of Tanks. The community keeps discussing and addressing the problems, not because they hate World of Tanks, they keep doing it because they see the potential in World of Tanks, of what it could become. They acknowledge the bad aspects of the game, and even if they don't directly admit or distinguish the positives of the game, I'm pretty sure they are aware of its existence. The players who have left the game and keep reappearing in the comment section of World of Tanks videos and streams don't keep reappearing because they despise the game, they keep coming back to see if the game that they used to love has finally turned into that epic game that they know is hiding there, behind all the bullshit. The World of Tanks community might be many things. Toxic, annoying, nonsensical, noobs, idiots, lemmings, gold spammers, tomatoes, tryhards, campers, bots. All of those things. But the community is also people. People who genuinely care for the game's health and want it to become that exciting tank warfare masterpiece that truly is in there. It's the community that ties this game together. It's the community that creates the memes, the videos, the streams, the discussions and the articles. It's the community that reminds us that we are not just playing a game, we are also part of a culture. A culture where collecting and playing with historical vehicles is considered cool. A culture where analyzing and discussing an obscure prototype tank from the Second World War is a thrilling experience. A culture where going to Tankfest is the most epic thing that could ever happen. A culture where a long sausage-shaped battleship of a tank called Tog is considered an iconic rock star. A culture where two idiots from Sweden made a YouTube channel called AwesomeEpicGuys because they loved World of Tanks so much and eventually become commanders inside the game for some irrational reason. World of Tanks is more than a game. It's a passion and a lifestyle. Oh, are you still here? I thought you were gone. Oh man, that was a long one. I'm wearing a different shirt now because it has taken quite a while to record this one. The funny thing is though, we have just scraped the top of the iceberg on all of these topics, so we could go into much further detail into all of these topics, but that would probably take like too many hours to just make a video about. But luckily, we do have a comment section where we can discuss these topics further if you're interested. Usually we do prefer to make like funny moments types of videos, but sometimes we do like to dive into these more serious topics of World of Tanks. But next video will probably be a more light-hearted video. But if you did enjoy this style of video, please do let us know by liking the video or, you know, subscribing to the channel or giving us a comment about it. It really means a lot, honestly. Anyhow, thanks for watching this clusterfuck of a video. I'll see you in the next one, hopefully. Bye bye. Have a good one.